As you sit there listening, perhaps in the quiet of the evening or in a moment of stillness carved out of a busy day, I want to invite you to cast your mind back to the year 1790.
It is a remarkable year to visit.
It really is. We are going to step into a remarkably profound space of thought, exploring Immanuel Kant's monumental book, The Critique of Judgment.
There is a quiet majesty to this text.
Yeah, a sense of a brilliant mind trying to reconcile the very foundations of human experience. Our mission tonight is to wander through the architecture of this specific book together, to understand exactly how Kant built a bridge between the cold, deterministic laws of physics and the boundless realm of human freedom.
Because it's a structural crisis that requires a masterful resolution. As we know, Kant had already established two massive, unyielding pillars of his philosophy before this.
Right, the earlier critiques.
Exactly. In 1781, he gave us the rules of the physical universe, mapping out the strict limits of human knowledge. Then, a few years later, in 1788, he explored the moral law and the absolute freedom of the human will.
But this created a profound friction, didn't it?
A massive friction. He had effectively trapped humanity between two entirely different worlds. On one side, we are bound by the understanding, which operates within a strictly deterministic, mechanical framework of cause and effect.
The realm of what we can know.
Yes. And on the other side, we are elevated by reason, operating in a transcendent realm of absolute freedom, of morals, of what we ought to do. So the agonizing question becomes this: if our bodies are entirely bound by deterministic physical laws, how can we possibly be morally free agents? Kant realized he needed a keystone to lock this entire philosophical arch into place.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if you leave those two worlds completely isolated, the human experience just fractures. We know he's trapped us between the determinism of the understanding and the moral freedom of reason. So how exactly does this third book propose to cross a gap that Kant himself had previously insisted could not be crossed? How does this new faculty he calls judgment actually serve as the bridge?
To see the bridge clearly, we have to look at the mechanics of human thought. It helps to visualize this through the structure of a classic logical syllogism.
Like the kind we learn in basic philosophy.
Exactly like that. A syllogism has three parts: a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. In Kant's system, the understanding provides the major premise. It hands us the massive, abstract, overarching universal rules of reality.
But a universal rule is useless on its own.
Precisely. It needs to be grounded. It's just floating in abstraction. This is where the faculty of judgment steps in as the minor premise. Judgment's entire job is to take that immense universal rule and delicately apply it to a single, specific, tangible case sitting right in front of us.
And then the third part.
Finally, reason steps in to draw the ultimate moral conclusion from that pairing. So judgment is the vital intermediary. It governs our internal feelings of pleasure and pain, allowing the universal rules of the understanding to actually touch our lived physical experience.
That structural clarity makes the abstraction feel so incredibly grounded. So Kant pivots in the first half of the book to how we judge the world reflectively, how this faculty operates when we look at objects around us. But surely he doesn't lump all our feelings of pleasure or appreciation into one single bucket. How does he differentiate the ways we react to the world?
He is incredibly meticulous about this. He identifies four distinct reflective judgments. Essentially, these are the four ways we can feel about an object. We can find it agreeable, we can find it beautiful, we can find it sublime, or we can find it good.
Four very different emotional states.
Very different. But it is the second of these, the beautiful, that consumes his deepest attention. And to explain beauty, he introduces a concept he calls free play.
Free play. That sounds almost too poetic for Kant. What exactly is playing?
It is surprisingly poetic. When we encounter something truly beautiful, a unique, almost silent interaction occurs between two of our cognitive powers, our imagination and our understanding.
So they interact, but usually that interaction is quite rigid, right?
Usually, yes. Usually, our understanding wants to ruthlessly clamp down on an object. It wants to categorize it, label it, and file it away so we can move on. But in the presence of beauty, the object stubbornly eludes strict categorization.
It resists being put in a box.
It does. The understanding cannot quite pin it down. Instead of frustration, though, the imagination and the understanding enter into a harmonious, unconstrained dance. They stimulate each other in a state of free play. We don't acquire any new concrete facts or knowledge from this dance, but the profound harmony of this mental state generates a lingering, serene pleasure within us.
I want to make sure we can visualize what triggers that specific dance. because he uses a phrase that feels a bit like a riddle. He says that for something to be judged as beautiful, it must possess the form of finality, or purposiveness without purpose. That sounds inherently contradictory. Can you unpack what it actually feels like to encounter something that looks perfectly designed, yet does absolutely nothing?
It's a beautiful riddle. Think about walking along a deserted coastline in the early morning.
Okay, I'm there.
You look down and find a piece of driftwood that has been relentlessly smoothed and shaped by the ocean for decades. As you pick it up, the curves perfectly fit the palm of your hand. The grain of the wood is flawlessly symmetrical. The weight is perfectly balanced.
It feels intentional.
Exactly. It looks exactly as though a master craftsman spent years designing it for a highly specific, vital use. It possesses an undeniable, striking purposiveness. Your mind recognizes the design, yet it has no apparent practical function whatsoever.
Right, it isn't a tool.
It is not a hammer, it is not a wedge, it doesn't solve any mechanical problem. That is purposiveness without purpose. The mind recognizes the profound harmony of its form, but it is entirely liberated from assigning it a utilitarian job.
Think about how you, listening right now, decorate your own living space. That distinction really echoes the line Kant draws between free beauty and adherent beauty. Are you choosing objects for your home just for their pure form, a swirling geometric sculpture, a beautiful but abstract line painted on a canvas where you don't need to know what it's supposed to be?
That pure form is what he calls free beauty.
But so much of what we interact with is adherent beauty, where we bring our own conceptual baggage to the table.
You've hit on the exact friction point Kant is trying to resolve there. Adherent beauty forces us to bring a predetermined concept into the room with us. Kant uses the example of a well-built horse.
A living animal, not an abstract shape.
Right. When we look at a magnificent horse and judge it to be beautiful, we aren't just admiring abstract shapes like we would with the driftwood. We have a concept in our minds of what a horse is, and critically, what a horse is supposed to do.
We judge it against its nature.
We are judging the animal's physical form against its inherent purpose. We find the horse beautiful precisely because its powerful muscles, its sleek frame, and its proud posture perfectly adheres to its function as a running, living creature. Adherent beauty is only possible if the object's form flawlessly suits its intended existence.
Which introduces such a strict requirement for how we appreciate things. He insists that a true judgment of beauty must be entirely disinterested. And by that, he doesn't mean we are bored by the object. He means our appreciation must be completely severed from our own personal appetites.
That separation is vital.
If you look at a masterful painting of a bowl of fruit and you feel a pang of physical hunger, you aren't experiencing beauty. You're merely experiencing what he calls the agreeable. Beauty demands a quiet, serene detachment. And yet, from that detached state, he makes an incredibly bold claim about how we share this beauty. He says it commands subjective universality.
It is a fascinating paradox. Let's compare two experiences. If I drink a certain cup of coffee and say, I like this, I'm only speaking for myself, I don't demand that you like it, my pleasure is deeply personal and subjective.
It's just your taste in coffee.
Exactly. But Kant observes that when we stand before a breathtaking painting or a magnificent cathedral and we declare, this is beautiful, our tone changes. We are no longer merely stating a personal preference. We are speaking with a strange, quiet authority, as if we expect, even demand, that every other human being on earth ought to agree with us.
Even though we can't logically prove it.
Right. We do not have a mathematical formula or a logical proof to force their agreement, which is why it remains subjective. Yet we speak as if the beauty is a universal fact. We subconsciously assume that there is a shared cognitive architecture among all humanity, and that everyone's mind ought to enter into the exact same harmonious free play when presented with this form.
But that restful, harmonious detachment doesn't last, does it? Kant doesn't just leave us in a peaceful art gallery admiring pure forms. He abruptly pushes us out the door and into the storm. Here's where it gets really interesting, because he introduces the concept of the sublime.
The shift from beauty to the sublime is a radical shift from harmony to awe. Beauty, as we established, is found in bounded forms, in limits, in proportions. It induces a state of restful contemplation.
And the sublime.
The sublime is sparked by the exact opposite. It is triggered by the formless, the chaotic, the incomprehensibly vast. It is found in things that seem to violently violate all sense of purpose. When we encounter the sublime, our minds are not at rest. It incites a severe, almost violent mental movement.
A feeling of being overwhelmed.
We experience a profound awe that is inextricably mixed with a kind of non-threatening terror, a divine pain that stretches our imagination until it feels like it might break.
And he breaks this overwhelming experience down into two categories. There is the mathematical sublime, which is all about pure, unadulterated magnitude. Imagine walking out into a freezing, completely clear winter night, far away from any city lights, and looking up the Milky Way.
That perfectly captures the mathematical sublime.
The sheer, staggering vastness of the cosmos, the millions of light years of empty space, physically overwhelms the mind's ability to measure or comprehend it. Your imagination fails.
Yeah.
And then there's the dynamical sublime. This relates to overwhelming, destructive power.
The power of nature in motion.
Picture standing behind a thick pane of glass at the edge of a cliff, looking down at a tempestuous ocean during a hurricane, watching million-ton waves violently smash against the rocks.
And here is the critical revelation, perhaps the most breathtaking pivot in the entire book. Kant argues that absolutely nothing in nature is actually inherently sublime.
Wait, so the hurricane itself isn't sublime. The cosmos isn't sublime. It's literally just wind, water, and burning gas.
Yeah.
The awe we feel is just us looking into a psychological mirror.
Exactly. The sublimity does not reside in the physical world. The dark ocean is merely water moving in strict accordance with gravity and thermodynamics. The sublimity resides entirely, exclusively within the human mind.
So nature's is just the trigger.
The staggering scale of the universe or the terrifying power of the storm simply serves as a catalyst. It awakens our awareness of our own inner greatness. Kant calls this our supersensible destination. When the imagination collapses in the face of a hurricane, our pure reason steps in and realizes that we possess a moral and rational capacity that completely transcends mere physical nature.
We realize we are more than just physical matter.
Nature might be able to easily crush our fragile physical bodies, but it can never ever touch the absolute freedom of our moral reason. The terror of the storm shrinks into nothingness when compared to the quiet majesty of the human mind.
There is a quiet, almost amusing historical irony here. Kant wrote with such visceral, breathtaking insight about the terror and awe of savage mountainous scenery. He describes the psychological weight of towering, jagged peaks with absolute precision. Yet, Kant spent his entire life in the flat plains around Königsberg. He never actually saw a mountain with his own eyes.
It's incredible to think about.
His understanding of the sublime was generated purely by the immense power of his own internal reason.
That quirk of his personality, his deep reliance on pure reason over the senses, extends to his views on art as well. He distrusted mere bodily sensations so much that he believed color in a painting was merely an extraneous charm.
Extraneous. Just a distraction.
To Kant, color was nothing more than a sensory distraction that pulled the mind away from the true structural beauty of the artist's lines and composition.
Which makes his analysis of how humans actually create art all the more fascinating. If it's all about pure form, how do we produce something genuinely beautiful? Kant defines fine art specifically as the art of genius. But he defines genius not just as a high intellect, but as an innate, almost mysterious mental disposition. Through genius, nature itself works through the artist to give rules to art.
And because it is an innate disposition, a gift of nature rather than a learned skill, true genius cannot actually explain its own creative process. A brilliant physicist can sit down and write a meticulous step-by-step manual on how they arrived at a new theorem so that any student can replicate it.
But an artist can't do that.
A genius painter or poet cannot explain how they conceived of a masterpiece. They don't communicate in literal concepts. They communicate what Kant calls aesthetical ideas. These are profound intuitions generated by the imagination. They are so rich, so densely layered, that no human language or definitive concept can ever fully capture or exhaust them. They hint at vast unspoken truths that lie far beyond the reach of literal words.
But there is a vital counterweight to this. If a genius simply pours out unrestrained, chaotic, aesthetical ideas, the result would be madness, not art. This overflowing imagination must be constantly kept in check by the rigorous discipline of taste. Taste provides the structure, the editing, the self-mastery that maintains the sanity of the artwork. Kant suggests it is actually better to lose a little bit of the wildfire of genius than to violate the universal canons of taste.
This delicate balance of order and creation flows perfectly into the second half of the book. Having exhaustively dealt with aesthetic judgment, Kant now leaves the art gallery and walks out into the natural world. He turns to teleological judgment.
The study of purpose.
Yes, he begins to rigorously question how we make sense of purpose in the universe itself.
And to do this, he draws a stark line between two different kinds of natural processes, On one side, we have mechanism. Think of the slow formation of a rock crystal deep underground. Kant admits the crystal is highly structured, and we might even call it beautiful, but its creation is entirely blind.
Just atoms colliding.
Right, the inevitable result of atoms colliding according to strict, unthinking physical laws. But on the other side, we have what he calls the technique of nature. This is the purposeful operation we find uniquely in organic biological life.
The contrast is staggering when you look closely at it. Take the analogy of a growing tree, which Kant uses to great effect. If you look at a mechanical object, say a pocket watch, the gears are assembled by an outside force. The gears only work together because a watchmaker placed them there.
The parts don't care about each other.
But a tree is fundamentally different. Every single part of a tree exists by means of the other parts and exists for the sake of the whole. The roots draw water to feed the leaves. The leaves capture sunlight to feed the roots. Furthermore, a tree produces another tree. It is entirely self-organizing and self-propagating. You cannot explain the existence of a tree by simply pointing to blind atoms bouncing off each other in the dark.
It's a remarkable observation, especially considering he is writing this decades before Darwin. Kant looks at the biological world and genuinely anticipates the broad strokes of evolutionary theory. He looks at the structural similarities across species and suggests that everything from human beings down to the simplest polyps and even further down to the mosses and lichens might share a common ancestral parent.
He saw the vast chain of life.
And yet, despite seeing this physical connection, Kant insists with absolute certainty that no purely mechanical theory of evolution will ever fully explain the phenomenon of life. He famously declares that it is utterly absurd for humans to ever hope for a Newton of a blade of grass.
That phrase, a Newton of a blade of grass, perfectly encapsulates his skepticism. Isaac Newton gave us the mechanical laws that explain the cold, lifeless orbit of the planets and the falling of a stone. But Kant argues that no future physicist, no matter how brilliant, will ever be able to explain the purposeful, self-organizing growth of the simplest plant using only the blind, deterministic laws of physics.
It's a completely different kind of existence.
Mechanism can explain the rock, but it cannot explain the living root that possesses the internal drive to break that rock apart.
So what does this all mean? If mechanical physics cannot explain the profound teleology, the undeniable purpose we see everywhere in the natural world, how do we explain it? We are forced to search for an ultimate cause.
Kant approaches this search by calmly and methodically dismantling the alternative theories of his day. First, he looks at hylozoism. This was the ancient idea that matter itself is somehow alive, that every atom possesses its own inner soul or vital force.
A living universe.
Kant dismisses this as a pure contradiction in terms. The very definition of physical matter in his system is that it is lifeless and possesses inertia. To speak of living matter is logically absurd. Next, he examines Spinozism.
The philosophy of Spinoza.
Yes, Spinoza argued that everything in the universe, mind and matter, is simply a different manifestation of one single underlying substance. But Kant argues that this doesn't explain purpose. It actually explains purpose away. It melts the entire universe into a vague, deterministic unity, but it utterly fails to account for the highly specific, intricate adaptations we see in a bird's wing or a human eye.
So if those fail, what is left?
Having logically discarded these alternatives, he concludes that theism, the concept of an intelligent author and governor of nature, remains the only logical working hypothesis left to us.
There is a truly fascinating philosophical comparison brought up here to justify this, which is the other minds analogy. Think about how we interact with each other every day. As I sit here talking to you, I cannot actually see your consciousness. I cannot physically touch your mind.
I am just a voice and a body to you.
Exactly. But I observe your external behavior. You act purposefully, you respond, you adapt. Because your actions resemble mine, I make a very reasonable assumption that you have a conscious mind just like I do. The question then becomes, if we effortlessly assume other humans have minds because they act purposefully, why can't we easily apply that exact same logic to the staggering purposiveness of nature itself and definitively prove the existence of an intelligent author?
Because, Kant argues, that is where we hit the absolute unyielding limit of human reason. When we infer that another human being has a mind, We are reasoning by analogy within our own realm of experience. Other humans are finite creatures. They are bound by the exact same dimensions of space and time that we are.
We understand what it means to be finite.
We intimately understand the parameters of finite existence. But when we look at the vastness of nature and try to infer a supreme mind behind it, we are trying to point toward an infinite mind. And an infinite mind lies entirely, fundamentally outside our realm of physical experience. We have zero sensory data for infinity.
So we can't prove it.
Therefore, Kant establishes a rigorous boundary. He concludes that theism can never be a dogmatic, scientifically proven fact. We cannot prove an intelligent author the way we prove a mathematical equation. Instead, it must remain a regulative principle.
A regulative principle.
It is a necessary assumption, a profound thing of faith that we must hold on to in order to guide our scientific investigations and anchor our moral lives, but it remains strictly beyond the veil of theoretical proof.
But Kant doesn't leave us stranded in a state of agnostic despair. He simply shifts the ultimate proof of a supreme being away from the external, physical world and moves it entirely into the quiet inner realm of the human conscience. The true evidence is not found in the design of a flower, but in the unyielding presence of the moral law within us.
And this brings us to the final, most profound mystery embedded in the book, the concept of the supersensible substrate. For Kant, this is the ultimate, unknowable ground of all reality.
How does he visualize that ground?
Imagine an incredibly vast, invisible underground root system. On the surface, you see two completely different species of trees. One represents the cold, deterministic mechanisms of physical nature, and the other represents the absolute, unconditioned freedom of the human mind. They appear entirely separate.
The two sides of the friction we started with.
Exactly. But deep underground, in that inaccessible depth, they are connected to the exact same source. In this supersensible substrate, nature and freedom are no longer at odds. They unite into a single, incomprehensible whole.
It is a staggering thought. He takes us by the hand, walks us right up to the very edge of human comprehension, and points out into the darkness toward an absolute being whose necessary lawful actions are, miraculously, the exact outcome of perfect freedom.
It is a realization that forces us to completely reevaluate the architecture of our own minds, permanently dismantling the hard barriers we perceive between the natural world we observe and the free will we experience.
And as you stand on that very boundary between the world of the senses and the pure freedom of the mind, the real question becomes how we begin to construct our reality from here. And tracking that continuous thread of thought we arrive at. Well, it is what can really only be described as the architectural keystone of human cognition. I mean, we are sitting with Immanuel Kant's monumental book, Critique of Judgment.
It really is a monumental text. It's the sheer scale of what it attempts to do.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And we are no longer just looking at a book here. We are examining the very blueprint of how your mind constructs the reality you live in every single day.
Right. It is the underlying machinery.
The core mission of the text is breathtaking when you let the noise of the world fade away and just sit quietly with it. We are trying to understand exactly how the human mind bridges a vast, seemingly impassable gap.
An immeasurable gulf, really.
Yes. Picture this gap for a moment. On one side, we have the rigid, deterministic laws of nature. This is a universe of pure cause and effect where every action is physically dictated by what came before it.
The completely closed loop.
Right. And then on the other side, we have the infinite, unconditioned possibilities of human freedom. How do these totally different worlds connect within us?
It requires a profound quietness of mind to truly unpack that question. To understand the bridge the text builds, we have to deeply understand the distinct shores it connects.
The shores being the different philosophies.
Exactly. The author divides philosophy into distinct realms. One is the theoretical realm. Think of this as natural philosophy. It is entirely governed by our faculty of understanding.
Okay, so the understanding.
Yes. It deals strictly with the concepts of nature, the observable phenomena, the unwavering rules of cause and effect that dictate the physical universe you move through.
Gravity, thermodynamics, things like that.
Precisely. The other is the practical realm. This is moral philosophy, which is governed by reason, and its foundational concept is freedom.
Freedom from those exact laws of nature.
Right. It is the quiet internal domain of what ought to be rather than what simply is.
Wait, let me just pause right there. Because when you say the word practical, my mind immediately goes to fixing a leaky faucet, or balancing a budget, or figuring out the most efficient way to commute to work.
The everyday practicalities.
Yeah. Is that what the text means when it talks about the practical realm? Because that sounds an awful lot like cause and effect to me.
That is a brilliant distinction to make. And the book takes great care to clarify this exact misconception because it trips so many people up.
It is a confusing word.
It is. When we hear the word practical today, we almost always think of utility, getting things done in the physical world. But the text draws a razor-sharp, uncompromising line between technically practical rules and morally practical laws.
Okay, technically practical versus morally practical.
The author uses such wonderfully grounded examples to illustrate this. Think of farming or statesmanship, or a doctor prescribing a specific diet for a patient, or even the delicate, nuanced art of conversation.
Right, so if I want to have a good conversation, I learn the skill of listening and responding. Or if I want a crop to yield, I plant the seed at a specific depth in a specific soil. We call those practical skills in everyday life.
Exactly, but the book classifies them merely as corollaries to theoretical philosophy. They are technically practical. They rely entirely on the natural laws of cause and effect.
Because planting a seed relies on biology.
Yes, if you plant a seed in a certain way, it grows. If you speak to a person with a certain tone, they react. They are rules of skill. They are completely bound by the deterministic laws of nature, and they have absolutely nothing to do with true moral freedom.
They are just manipulations of the physical world.
Right. Morally practical laws belong to a completely different class of existence. They are not based on the sensible world you can touch and see. They are based on the super-sensible principle of freedom.
So they do not dictate how to manipulate nature to get a desired physical result.
No, not at all. Rather, they dictate how a free will ought to determine itself entirely independent of natural causes.
So we're really talking about a fundamental divide in how we experience existence, which leads into a fascinating geographic metaphor the text uses. It talks about the distinction between a territory and a realm.
A very helpful way to visualize it.
Yeah. And as I am reading this right, it is like imagining a single vast expanse of land. Think of the entire landscape of your human experience. That landscape is our territory. It is simply a domain where knowledge is possible for us.
The ground we walk on metaphorically.
Right. Nature, the physical world of sensory experience you wake up to every day, is our territory.
That is a beautiful way to visualize it. Nature is the territory. But a realm is something much more specific. A realm is a domain where a specific cognitive faculty actually legislates.
It makes the laws.
Exactly. It is where that faculty makes the rules and governs with absolute authority. So over this single expanse of land, the territory of our experience, we have totally different invisible sovereigns ruling simultaneously.
The understanding has its realm over nature legislating the physical laws of phenomena, gravity, biology, all of that. And reason has its realm over freedom legislating moral laws.
Yeah.
Duty ethics, that quiet voice of conscience.
Two different sovereigns.
And suddenly, looking at it this way, introduces that immeasurable gulf we mentioned. We have the sensible world of nature on one shore, and the supersensible world of freedom on the other.
Completely isolated from one another.
Right. It is as if they are totally different universes existing parallel to one another within you, so fundamentally distinct that they cannot possibly influence each other through any theoretical use of reason.
And yet, herein lies the central, beautiful paradox of human existence. The entire concept of moral freedom is meant to actualize its purposes right here in the sensory world.
It has to happen here.
It does. You form a moral intention in the unconditioned, supersensible realm of freedom, but you must carry out that action in the physical, deterministic realm of nature.
Like deciding to tell the truth.
Exactly. You decide to tell the truth, which is a moral imperative, but you must use your physical vocal cords and the physics of sound waves to do it. Therefore, there must be a hidden ground of unity.
A connection point.
There absolutely has to be a bridge between these isolated worlds. A way to transition our mode of thought from the strict principles of nature to the liberating principles of freedom.
But if they are so totally divorced, how do we actually function? There has to be a middleman. There has to be some mechanism inside our minds that negotiates this impossible divide.
There is. Sitting quietly right in the middle of our cognitive architecture is the faculty of judgment. The book breaks down the soul into a triad of fundamental faculties that cannot be derived from one another.
A triad.
We have the faculty of knowledge, which maps directly to our understanding. We have the faculty of desire, which maps directly to our reason. And nestled perfectly intimately between knowledge and desire is the feeling of pleasure and pain.
And that feeling maps to judgment.
It maps entirely to the faculty of judgment.
It is as if judgment is a masterful translator or a brilliantly sensitive diplomat. Imagine a diplomat moving quietly between the warring nations of nature and freedom.
A perfect analogy.
Because nature speaks only in the language of what is, and freedom speaks only in the language of what ought to be. The diplomat's job is to find a hidden harmony that neither side could perceive on its own.
To understand how this diplomat works in your own mind, we must look at the mechanics of judgment, which the text divides into distinct types: determinate and reflective.
Okay, let's break those down.
Determinate judgment is relatively straightforward. It is comforting, even. The universal law is already known and given to us by the understanding. The mind simply takes a particular singular instance and files it neatly under that existing universal law.
Like gravity.
Right. If you know the universal law of gravity and you're holding an apple and let it go, your determinate judgment simply files that falling apple under the law of gravity. There is no mystery.
It just fits into the pre-existing box.
Exactly.
But reflective judgment, that is where the true mystery and the quiet beauty of the human mind begin. In reflective judgment, the particular instance is given to us, but the universal law is completely missing.
You have no box to put it in.
Right. You are handed the falling apple, but you have no concept of gravity. The mind has to search for the rule. And think about what that implies for a moment.
It implies a staggering amount of work for the mind.
When you look out at nature, you are immediately confronted by an infinite, chaotic variety of empirical laws. There's so many different forms, so many disparate phenomena. Color, sounds, textures, behaviors.
It is a profound chaos. Think about the sheer volume of sensory data bombarding you at any given moment. Without a way to organize it, it is just noise.
Overwhelming noise.
How do you even begin to make sense of this chaotic variety without your cognitive faculties simply shutting down from the overwhelm?
We survive this chaos through a very specific a priori principle that the reflective judgment gives entirely to itself. And this is a concept you really have to let sink in, the purposiveness of nature.
Purposiveness?
Because reflective judgment must ascend from the particular sensory detail to a universal law. It assumes a guiding thread. It operates as if an alien direct. Understanding a higher intellect, completely different from our own human minds, had intentionally designed and organized the chaotic empirical laws of nature, specifically so that our cognitive faculties could comprehend them.
The text uses a fascinating, highly specific term here: heteonomy.
Heteonomy.
Yes. The judgment is not giving a law to nature, which would be autonomy. It is giving a law to itself for its own subjective use in reflecting upon nature.
Let me make sure I am visualizing this correctly. It sounds like the mind is writing a user manual for a machine it didn't even build, and then pretending the machine was built specifically to match the manual.
That is a surprisingly perfect way to frame it. The mind needs the universe to be comprehensible, so it legislates a rule for itself. I will act as though the universe wants to be understood by me.
It is a survival mechanism for the intellect.
It is. This principle of purposiveness is so deeply vital, and the book goes to great lengths to explain why it is a transcendental principle rather than a metaphysical one.
Meaning it is foundational to experience itself.
Exactly. A transcendental principle is a necessary foundational condition for us to experience objects in general. It does not rely on any specific empirical data you might collect. It is the pure concept of how empirical cognition is even possible in the first place.
And the text highlights this by pointing to specific maxims we use without even thinking about them when investigating nature. We say things like, nature takes the shortest way.
Or nature makes no leaps.
Right. Or principles must not be multiplied beyond necessity.
And it is crucial to realize, sitting here right now, that these maxims are not objective facts about how the physical universe actually operates.
Because the universe doesn't owe us simplicity.
The universe has absolutely no obligation to be simple. It has no obligation to avoid leaps. The universe could be infinitely complex and disjointed. Rather, these maxims represent a logical necessity for how you and I ought to judge nature.
They are the rule of the game we have to play.
They are the subjective rules our reflective judgment must employ to make a unified, coherent experience out of infinite diversity.
So when this process succeeds, when we manage to unify a chaotic jumble of empirical laws into a single comprehensible system, something extraordinary happens within us. Think about the last time you suddenly understood a complex concept, or saw how different pieces of a puzzle fit together perfectly. What did you feel in that exact moment?
You feel pleasure. It is a profound, almost bodily relief from a deep cognitive need. We assumed nature would be harmonious with our mind, and when we actually find that harmony, it feels like a lucky chance, a sudden relief of tension.
A spark of joy.
Yes. And the book notes something so deeply observant about human history here. Today, as modern people, we no longer feel overt bubbling joy at the basic comprehensibility of nature.
We take it for granted.
We do. You do not wake up and celebrate the fact that the sun rises in a predictable arc or that species of birds can be neatly categorized because it has become the common background noise of your daily experience.
But the text reminds us that this profound pleasure of discovery was historically necessary. Early on in human consciousness, that intense spark of cognitive pleasure was the reward mechanism.
It pushed us forward.
It was the joy that drove us to build our fundamental systematic experience of the world. We organized the chaos because it felt incredibly good to do so.
Which brings us to a beautifully subtle distinction in how we represent this purposiveness of nature. We can represent it objectively, which the text calls the logical or teleological representation.
Teleological meaning end-driven.
Right. This happens when you look at an object, say a highly organized biological body like a delicate flower, and you judge it according to a specific pre-existing concept of what that thing is supposed to be.
So you look at the petals and think about pollination.
You measure its physical form against its objective purpose.
But there is another way to experience the flower, a purely subjective way, which the text calls the aesthetical representation. And this is where the philosophy turns into poetry.
It truly does.
The aesthetical representation strips away all concepts. It does not care about pollination. It is the pure, immediate apprehension of a form. And the mechanism of this aesthetical judgment is incredibly elegant.
It is a delicate balance.
When you perceive a beautiful form, your imagination, the faculty that blindly gathers up all your raw sensory intuitions, and your understanding, the faculty of rigid concepts, fall into a spontaneous, undesigned harmony.
They enter into a state of free play. You are not trying to categorize the object. You are not trying to figure out what it is used for. The mind simply harmonizes with the form of the object, and that quiet internal harmony is felt immediately as pleasure.
And out of this subjective feeling arises what has to be the most fascinating paradox of taste. A judgment of taste is entirely subjective. It is based purely on an internal feeling of pleasure, not on any logical concept or objective data.
Purely internal.
And yet it demands universal agreement. When you stand before a breathtaking sunset and say it is beautiful, you do not just mean it is pleasant for you personally. You speak as if beauty were a property of the sunset itself.
You project it outwards.
You expect everyone else standing next to you to agree.
To illustrate why this is so strange, the text provides a wonderful comparative example. Imagine looking through a lens and perceiving a movable drop of water trapped perfectly inside an ancient ice crystal.
Wow, just visualizing that.
Take a moment to really visualize that. The coldness of the ice, the clarity, the tiny bubble of liquid water suspended inside. This is a singular empirical judgment of fact.
It is an objective reality.
And because it is based on objective observation, you naturally expect everyone else who looks through that lens to see the exact same thing. It is a fact of the territory.
Yes, but here's the twist.
Yeah.
Similarly, when we make a judgment of taste, when we say the way the light catches that ice crystal is beautiful, we demand that everyone else should feel the exact same harmony we are feeling.
We expect the feeling to be universal.
We expect universal agreement, not because we share the same logical concepts or optical facts, but because we assume all human beings share the very same cognitive architecture. We assume everyone has the same relationship between imagination and understanding.
We must be very careful with this assumption, though. The book emphasizes repeatedly that asking if something is beautiful adds absolutely zero cognitive data to our understanding of the object.
None at all.
Think about that. If you tell me a flower is beautiful, I have learned absolutely nothing new about the biological structure, the cellular makeup, or the evolutionary history of the flower.
You have only learned about the state of my mind in response to it. You have learned that my cognitive faculties are in a state of harmonious free play.
Exactly.
And this observation leads into what is arguably the absolute core rule of beauty laid out in the text. The satisfaction we take in the beautiful must be completely, utterly disinterested.
Disinterested satisfaction. When we judge something as beautiful, we must be utterly indifferent to its actual existence. We must have no desire to possess it, consume it, or use it for any purpose.
It has to be pure contemplation.
The text uses a striking example to make this point. Imagine you are standing before a magnificent, sprawling palace. The architecture is towering. The gardens are immaculate. Someone turns to you and asks, "Is this palace beautiful?"
And you might respond by bringing up Rousseau's Critique. You might say you despise the vanity of the rich who waste the labor of the people on such superfluous, extravagant things.
A moral critique.
Right. Or you might answer like the Iroquois sachem visiting Paris, who honestly admitted he preferred the practical warmth of the common cookshops to the empty, echoing grandeur of the palace.
What practical critique?
Or you might simply shrug and say that if you were stranded on an uninhabited island, you would never bother building such a useless structure.
And as the book points out, all of those answers completely miss the point of aesthetic beauty. They might be morally valid, they might be practically valid, but aesthetically they fail.
Because they bring interest into the equation.
Why do they fail? Because you are bringing an interest into the judgment. You are looking at the palace through the heavy lens of social justice or physical hunger or practical utility.
You are weighing it against a need.
The only thing that matters in a pure, unadulterated judgment of taste is the quiet, disinterested contemplation of the representation itself. To truly judge its beauty, you must not care if the palace actually exists in reality. You must only care about the feeling its form inspires in your mind.
It is a profound mental discipline, stripping away all your personal stakes in the world just to observe a form. To crystallize this even further, the text draws incredibly sharp contrasts between beauty, the pleasant, and the good.
Distinctions we blur all the time.
Because we conflate these all the time in everyday language. We often confuse beauty with the pleasant, but the pleasant is always bound up with physical interest.
Let's visualize that. If you look at a lush green meadow, the objective sensation of the green color is just perception. It is data. But the subjective sensation of pleasantness excites a physical desire.
It makes you want something.
It gratifies you. It creates an inclination toward the object. You want to walk in the meadow or lie down in it or graze sheep on it. You want to consume or possess the pleasant thing.
So it requires the meadow to be real.
The pleasant is entirely about enjoyment and gratification, and it relies heavily on the actual existence of the object. You cannot enjoy lying in a meadow that does not physically exist.
And on the other side of the spectrum, we must contrast beauty with the good. The good absolutely pleases us, but it does so through a concept of reason.
It is conceptual.
Something can be good as a means to an end, which we call the useful. A hammer is good because it drives a nail. Or it can be good in itself, possessing inherent moral worth. Telling the truth is good.
Both rely on an interest.
But in both of these cases, the good requires a concept and crucially requires an active interest in the existence of the object. If something is morally good, you want it to actually exist in the world. You want the truth to be spoken.
Beauty stands completely silently alone. It requires no concept like the good does. It excites no physical desire like the pleasant does. It is a free-floating, disinterested satisfaction.
When you really step back and look at it, it's a remarkable synthesis. As we trace these delicate, almost invisible lines connecting our intellect, our desires, and our capacity for pure pleasure, we begin to see the hidden architecture of all human experience revealed.
It is a grand, unified theory of the mind.
We see how the text maps the entirety of the mind into a cohesive whole.
The understanding is permanently tethered to nature and the deterministic physical laws of the universe. Reason is forever tethered to freedom and the moral laws of what ought to be.
And suspended beautifully between them, acting as the diplomat, is judgment. It maps to art, to the feeling of pleasure, and to the deep assumed purposiveness of form. And sitting with this leaves us with a lingering, almost haunting thought. Think about your own life. If true beauty requires absolutely no interest in the object's actual existence.
If the reality of it doesn't matter.
If the physical reality of the grand palace or the delicate flower or the ice crystal is entirely irrelevant to the aesthetic pleasure it provides, what does that say about the world we construct entirely within our own minds?
It is a staggering question.
How much of the profound, breathtaking beauty we see out there in the physical universe is actually just the quiet, spontaneous echo of our own cognitive faculties falling into harmony with themselves?
It suggests that the beauty of the world is not out there at all. It is a mirror reflecting your own internal design back at you.
Which brings us directly to the threshold of how that internal harmony begins to structure our actual experience of the sublime. Because when we look at, there is a strange, almost silent phenomenon that happens when we stand before something truly beautiful.
Yeah.
We just, we stop. We don't try to consume it. We don't try to use it to fix a problem. And we don't try to solve it like a puzzle. We just let it exist. Unpacking those hidden, incredibly complex mechanics of how the human mind actually judges beauty and taste is the core ambition of the book.
Right, and it's a massive ambition.
It is. And our mission here, as we continue our journey through this text, is to slow down. We are going to meticulously unravel how you and I experience the world. We need to draw a very careful, absolute line between what simply feels good to our physical senses, what our rational minds judge as morally right, and what is genuinely purely beautiful.
Because we tend to blur all of those together in everyday life.
We do. We use the word beautiful for everything.
Exactly. And it requires a really profound shift in how we observe our own everyday reactions to stop doing that. The book begins this unraveling by categorizing our experiences into three incredibly distinct kinds of satisfaction. We have to separate these before we can even begin to talk about beauty.
Okay.
The first, and probably the most common layer of our daily experience, is what is defined as the pleasant.
The pleasant.
Yeah, the pleasant is simply that which gratifies the senses. It is a fundamental biological reaction. Think of a dish heavily laden with spices and condiments. It stimulates the palate. It creates this immediate sensation of delight, but it is entirely private. It's driven by a physiological desire, by a fundamental want.
Which brings to mind that old saying mentioned in the book, hunger is the best sauce.
Yes.
If you are completely famished, almost anything edible is going to bring you a profound, overwhelming sense of satisfaction. It's like mindlessly eating fast food when you haven't eaten all day. Your brain lights up, but that satisfaction is entirely rooted in your physical deficit.
It's just your body filling a void.
Right. It has absolutely nothing to do with objective, refined taste. It's just survival.
Precisely. Because the pleasant is entirely subjective, it belongs strictly to the individual experiencing it in that specific moment.
It's locked in your own biology.
Exactly. If someone takes a sip of a beverage and declares, "Canary wine is pleasant," the text points out that it is perfectly fine and actually much more accurate for someone to correct them and say, "It is pleasant to you."
To you. Because I might hate canary wine.
Right. There is no expectation whatsoever that anyone else must find it pleasant. You don't demand that the rest of the world share your sensory cravings. And crucially, this kind of satisfaction is not unique to humans.
It applies to animals, right?
It applies equally to all animals. A dog can feel gratification from a warm patch of sunlight or a satisfying meal just as deeply and profoundly as we can. It is pure biology.
So if sensory pleasure is just a biological mechanism, where does that leave the things we actually value on a higher level? For instance, what happens when we look at a beautifully constructed, sturdy house, or we witness someone doing a profoundly good deed? We feel satisfaction there, but it clearly isn't the same as eating a heavy meal.
No, it's not. And that brings us to the second kind of satisfaction, which is the good.
The good.
This is an entirely different cognitive mechanism from the pleasant because it isn't about sensory gratification at all. The good has an objective worth, and it is always, without exception, tied to a specific concept or a purpose.
It requires reason.
It does. When we judge something as good, we are either saying it is useful as a means to an end, which is called mediately good, or we are saying it is good in itself, like that act of profound moral courage you mentioned.
So it requires a framework. If you view your own physical health as good, you aren't just feeling a sensory pleasure in that moment.
Yeah.
You are conceptualizing health as a state that allows you to accomplish your business, care for your family, live well. You are judging it based on what it does.
Precisely. The good demands a cognitive understanding of what an object or an action is supposed to be. And while the pleasant applies to animals, the good applies to all rational beings. It is the domain of logic, utility, and morality.
Which leaves us with a fascinating blank space. If the pleasant satisfies our animal instincts and the good satisfies our rational, calculating minds, what exactly is the beautiful?
The beautiful sits completely apart from the other two. Beauty is fundamentally absolutely disinterested.
Disinterested.
Yes. It involves no physical desire, no hunger, no craving, and absolutely no moral agenda. It doesn't fulfill a bodily need, and it doesn't try to teach you a lesson or serve a practical purpose. It just pleases freely.
That's a quiet, almost meditative word. Disinterested. It means we aren't trying to extract any value from the object. It's the difference between looking at a perfectly plated meal and admiring the colors and the symmetry versus actually wanting to devour it to cure your hunger.
Yes, you aren't trying to consume it. And because of this absolute detachment from use and desire, there is a stunning claim made here. Beauty is exclusively for humans.
Exclusively for humans.
Yeah.
Because we are the bridge.
Exactly. Think about our nature. We are the only beings that are both animal and rational. We have the biological senses required to perceive the physical form of a thing, but we also possess the cognitive architecture to appreciate that form without instantly needing to consume it or judge its utilitarian value.
Like looking at a sunset.
Right. When you look at a vibrant, sweeping sunset, You don't feel an urge to eat it, and you don't judge it for its moral righteousness. You just experience a free, disinterested satisfaction in its mere existence.
But wait, if beauty is so entirely disinterested and detached from our personal desires, why does it feel so deeply personal? And more importantly, why do we argue about it so much? If I prefer a blue shirt and you prefer a red one, we just shrug and move on. But if we disagree on beauty, it feels like a genuine conflict.
That's a great question, and the book addresses this by dividing our aesthetic reactions into two distinct categories: the taste of sense and the taste of reflection.
Okay, taste of sense and taste of reflection.
The taste of sense goes right back to the pleasant. One person might love the sound of wind instruments, while another vastly prefers strings. One person might look at a soft violet color and find it lovely, while another looks at the exact same shade and finds it washed out and faded.
And we don't care if people disagree with us on those things.
Not at all. It would be absurd to try and argue logically that someone must prefer the violin to the flute. That is merely the taste of sense.
But the taste of reflection operates under a completely different set of rules. When you stand before a magnificent, awe-inspiring building, or you read a poem that brings you to tears and you declare, "This is beautiful," it would be laughable to add the qualifier, "It is beautiful for me."
It really would. It would undermine the very concept of what beauty is. The text argues that when you make a genuine judgment of beauty, you are experiencing something called subjective universality.
Subjective universality. That sounds like an oxymoron.
It does, but let's unpack why we demand this agreement. Because your judgment of beauty is truly disinterested. Because you have successfully stripped away your personal biases, your selfish desires, and your private hungers. You feel, deep down, that you are judging from a purely, fundamentally human baseline.
So think about the last time you saw a film that completely moved you, something that felt like a masterpiece. If you showed it to a friend and they called it garbage, you wouldn't just say, "Oh, well, we have different tastes."
No, you'd be a little offended.
You would. You'd feel like they were missing something fundamentally human. You are speaking with what this philosophy calls a universal voice. You aren't claiming you have mathematical proof that the film is beautiful, but you are silently assuming that because you are experiencing this pure, unselfish delight, everyone else ought to feel the exact same way.
You expect agreement based on a shared human architecture. Which brings us to a concept that feels almost like a Zen riddle, but is central to understanding how our minds process this. It is the concept of purposiveness without purpose.
Purposiveness without purpose. It captures the core paradox perfectly. It describes an object that looks flawlessly designed, deeply harmonious, and intentionally put together, but it doesn't actually exist for any specific utilitarian reason.
The author paints a brilliant, vivid picture of this. Imagine you are walking through a wild, untamed, chaotic forest. Twigs are snapping under your feet, vines are tangled everywhere.
Just total natural chaos.
Exactly. And suddenly you stumble into a clearing and find a perfect, mathematically precise circle of trees. The arrangement is clearly purposive. It exhibits profound order and unmistakable design.
But to appreciate it aesthetically, you don't need to assume it was planted there specifically for the local villagers to hold country dances.
Right, you don't need a why. You simply appreciate the pure form of the design itself, entirely independent of any practical use.
So we were appreciating form over function. But what about something incredibly simple? What about just staring at a bright patch of green grass or hearing a single long note from a violin? There's no complex design there, no circle of trees, but it still feels deeply beautiful. How does that fit in?
The text actually addresses this using Euler's theory of ether vibrations. Now, the 18th century physics terminology might sound a bit archaic today.
Yeah, ether vibrations definitely sounds like something out of an old science fiction novel. What does that actually mean for you and me looking at a blade of grass?
Well, think of it as your brain rewarding you for recognizing pure frequency. When you see that pure green of the grass plot or hear that clean, solitary violin tone, your mind isn't just passively soaking in a raw, chaotic sensation.
It's doing something active.
Very active. It is subconsciously apprehending a very delicate formal geometry in the light or the sound waves. Your mind is perceiving the formal, regular, unbroken play of those vibrations. The satisfaction comes from the mind recognizing that flawless, repeating rhythm.
That makes so much sense. And that would explain why composite colors or muddy, distorted tones are considered less beautiful in this framework. Their purity can't be judged.
Exactly. The formal play of the vibrations is obscured and tangled. The mind can't track the geometry.
It's also why there is such a strict, almost ruthless rule about what are called parerga, or ornaments.
Yes, the parerga. This philosophy looks very critically at the additions we make to art. The picture frames we put around paintings, the sculpted draperies draped over statues, or the elaborate colonnades surrounding palaces.
And the rule here is quite unforgiving, isn't it?
It is. If those ornaments possess beautiful, regular form in their own right, like a masterfully carved wooden border with its own geometric rhythm, they enhance the art. But if a frame is just a heavy, gaudy piece of gold used merely for its sensory charm to make the painting seem more expensive or dazzling to the eye, it is classified as mere finery.
Finery. Just a distraction.
It distracts the mind from the formal play of vibrations and actually ruins the genuine beauty of the piece. It appeals to the pleasant, not the beautiful.
It is a demand for absolute, uncorrupted purity in our observation. And that demand for purity extends directly into another major distinction made in the book: the difference between pure or free beauty and adherent or dependent beauty.
This is a crucial distinction.
Does knowing what an object is actually ruin our ability to see it beautifully?
It fundamentally changes it. Free beauty is beauty that means nothing. It doesn't rely on a preconceived concept of what the object ought to be. The text lists flowers as a prime example of free beauty, provided you aren't a botanist.
Right, because if you are a botanist looking at a flower to analyze its reproductive organs and categorize its species, you are applying a concept.
You're judging it based on the good, on its utility and biological function. But for the rest of us, a flower just freely pleases the eye. We also see this in parrots, hummingbirds, birds of paradise, seashells, the intertwining foliage patterns on wallpaper, and musical fantasies without words.
They don't represent a specific, necessary concept. Because there is no strict rule for what a seashell must look like to do its job, the human imagination is entirely free to disport itself, to wander effortlessly in contemplating their figures.
Exactly, it's a free play.
But what about something like a church? I can't look at a massive stone church without instantly thinking about what a church is supposed to be, what happens inside it, and what it represents. Does that ruin the free play of my imagination?
It does. You've just stumbled perfectly onto adherent beauty. Adherent beauty is entirely dependent on a concept: a church, a palace, a summer house, or even a magnificent horse. When you look at a church, your judgment of its beauty is inevitably, unavoidably restricted by your concept of what a church is supposed to be. It has a purpose.
So the beauty is chained to its utility.
It is, and the text provides a very striking, specific example of how this restriction works. It notes that you could, theoretically, take all kinds of beautiful, sweeping spirals and light, mathematically regular lines. It references the intricate tattoos of the New Zealanders and cover a human figure with them.
As pure geometric form, those lines might be perfectly beautiful in isolation.
Yes, but you wouldn't apply them to a European concept of a human figure, especially not a warrior. Why? Because the underlying concept of what a human being is supposed to look like fundamentally restricts that free play.
You can't just slap beautiful wallpaper patterns onto a person because the concept of humanity clashes with the geometry.
The beauty is no longer free, it becomes entirely adherent to and constrained by the concept.
So if our minds are constantly restricting beauty based on what things ought to look like, how do we establish a baseline? Do we have a perfect image of a human being or a horse just floating in our subconscious?
We do have a baseline, but there is a very sharp distinction drawn between what is called the normal idea and the true ideal of beauty. The normal idea is a fascinating psychological mechanism. Imagine your mind acting as an incredibly powerful, completely subconscious statistician.
Okay, I'm picturing my brain with a clipboard, taking notes on everything I see.
That's a great way to look at it. Now, imagine you have seen 1,000 adult men over the course of your lifetime. To understand what the normal size and proportion of a man is, your imagination takes all 1,000 of those visual memories and optically overlays them, one right on top of the other.
Like stacking 1,000 semi-transparent photographs.
Exactly. Where the images overlap the most, the thickest, brightest contour right in the center, that reveals the average stature. The anomalies, the very tall or very short, fade to the edges.
It's the psychological mechanism of creating an archetype. So basically, the ultimate normal idea of a human is just the most remarkably uninteresting, perfectly average person on the planet. He might be structurally flawless, according to the math, but you would probably forget his face 5 seconds after looking at him.
That is precisely the point. The text mentions famous classical sculptures like Polycletus's Doryphorus, the spear bearer, or Myron's cow as physical representations of this normal idea. They perfectly represent the exact average of their species.
But they aren't the peak of beauty.
No, we are carefully warned that this average is merely correct. Because it is an exact, mathematical average, it is completely devoid of anything specifically characteristic. It lacks soul. Therefore, the normal idea cannot possibly be the highest form of beauty. It is just structurally devoid of error.
So if the perfectly average, structurally flawless form isn't the highest beauty, what is? How do we reach the peak?
To reach the highest form, we have to look to the ideal of beauty. And here, a profound philosophical pivot happens. It is stated that only humanity can have an ideal of beauty.
Because we have morality.
Yes, this is because, unlike a flower or a horse, only human beings carry the moral purpose of their existence strictly within themselves. We aren't just biological forms reacting to stimuli, we possess an internal, rational, moral compass. Therefore, the true ideal of beauty relies on the visible expression of those moral ideas.
The physical form must project the inner moral reality. Kindness, courage, profound thought. These must radiate through the physical structure.
It requires an incredible, delicate harmony between our physical senses taking in the geometry and our deepest rational truths acknowledging the soul inside.
But to even believe that we can share this incredibly complex ideal with others, we have to rely on a shared foundation. We have to assume that everyone else's mind works the exact same way.
Which introduces the concept of the sensus communis. Now, sensus communis translates literally to common sense, but we must be very clear. It does not mean ordinary, everyday practicality.
It doesn't mean having the common sense to look both ways before crossing the street.
No. It means a communal aesthetic feeling. When we stand before a masterpiece, feel that rush of disinterested awe, and demand that others agree it is beautiful, we are silently presupposing that every single human being shares this sensus communis. We assume we all share the exact same internal architecture for the free play of imagination and understanding.
We assume that deep down our minds resonate at the exact same frequency when confronted with pure form. But this raises a huge question. If our minds love form and order so much, why wouldn't perfect mathematical regularity be the ultimate beauty? Why wouldn't a flawlessly drawn circle, a perfect square, or a completely symmetrical room be the height of aesthetic joy?
Because perfect mathematical regularity is actually repugnant to pure taste.
Repugnant, that's a strong word.
It actively causes weariness. Think about a perfect square. A perfect square belongs strictly to the realm of cognition and practical use. Once your eye has traced one corner and one side of a perfect square, your mind instantly, effortlessly comprehends the entire shape.
The puzzle is solved in a microsecond.
Exactly. There is no mystery left. There is no free play left for the imagination to engage with. The mind is instantly bored.
There is a brilliant story in the text used to illustrate this exact weariness. The story of Marsden's pepper garden in Sumatra.
Yes. Marsden was traveling through the wild, untamed, chaotic beauty of the Sumatran forest. He was surrounded by unpredictable vines, wild foliage, and endless sensory chaos. Suddenly, he came across a pepper garden where the stakes were planted in perfectly parallel, mathematically precise rows.
And at first, he loved it, right? The sheer contrast of this stiff, human regularity against the wild jungle felt deeply beautiful to him. It was a relief.
At first, yes. But the book offers a critical, piercing analysis of Marsden's reaction. It argues that if Marsden actually had to sit in the middle of that perfectly parallel pepper garden all day long, the stiff regularity would very quickly cease to be beautiful.
It would shift from a relief to a prison.
It would begin to feel like a burdensome constraint on his mind. The imagination would feel trapped by the rigid, unchanging rules of the parallel lines.
The puzzle is already solved, so the mind have nothing left to do but stare at the cage. Whereas the wild, seemingly irregular, prodigal variety of nature provides what is beautifully described as constant food for taste.
Consider the deeply evocative examples given to contrast with that stiff regularity. The free, unstudied play of a rippling brook bubbling endlessly over stones, the constantly shifting, unpredictable dancing shapes of a fire burning on a hearth, or the wild, entirely unscripted song of a bird in the woods.
These things hold our attention indefinitely, precisely because they aren't following a rigid mathematical formula.
Contrast the wild, spontaneous song of a bird with the tiresome repetition of human music that strictly, rigidly follows every single academic rule of composition. The rigidly ruled music wearies us, it puts us to sleep, while the wild bird song continuously invites our imagination to play, to guess, and to wonder.
It's a breathtaking perspective on how we interact with the world around us. We aren't just passive receivers of light and sound. Our minds are constantly actively seeking a delicate balance between order and wild, unconstrained freedom.
And that balance is only achieved when we completely let go of our desire to own, to consume, or to rigidly categorize the object before us. We must step back, allow the object to simply be, and allow our imagination to dance with its form without demanding anything in return.
If true beauty requires us to strip away our personal desires, our hungers, and even our demand for logic and mathematical perfection, then perhaps the act of witnessing beauty is actually the closest human beings ever get to total unselfish freedom. Hold on to that thought of unselfish freedom, because as we turn the page and continue our journey deeper into the book, the implications of this freedom are about to shift everything we know about nature.
So, sitting down together again, in the quiet of this space, just picking up exactly where we left off. We are stepping into the fourth phase of our continuous 10-part journey through the book, Immanuel Kant's Critique of Judgment. And we have spent a lot of hours lingering in the serene, perfectly bounded world of the beautiful. But right here at section 23, the book asks us to just leave that safe, sunlit harbor behind. We are transitioning away from the gentle play of beauty and walking out into the dark to confront something entirely different.
Yeah, something overwhelming.
Right, awe-inspiring and
Yeah.
terrifying, honestly. The realm of the sublime. And by the end of this stretch, we are going to confront a deeply isolating question of how we can possibly demand that our own internal solitary taste should act as a universal rule for everyone else.
It is a profound, almost jarring pivot in the text.
Mm.
But before we look at how the beautiful and the sublime tear away from each other, it really helps to understand why the book binds them together in the first place.
Because they share a hidden architecture in our minds.
Exactly. Both of them please us inherently, just by existing. When you experience the beautiful or the sublime, your satisfaction doesn't come from a biological need being met, like the physical relief of drinking water when you are thirsty.
Right, it is not a biological drive.
No, and nor does it come from a strict logical concept, like the quiet satisfaction of doing the right moral thing. Instead, they operate through what the text calls a judgment of reflection.
Let's ground that term for a moment because judgment of reflection sounds incredibly abstract. If I understand the text correctly, it essentially means this is a feeling that bubbles up from the inside out rather than a factual property you learn from the outside in.
That is the perfect way to visualize it. It connects with our faculty of presentation. You are judging one specific singular moment or object, this single sunset or this specific storm.
And yet, mysteriously, your mind announces that this feeling should be universally valid for every human being, even though it is just a feeling of pleasure, not a piece of objective knowledge.
Precisely. There is a subtle yet profound shift happening here, though. The similarities between the two end almost as quickly as they begin. The text draws a stark line in the sand.
Right. The beautiful, it tells us, is entirely about boundaries. It is about form. When you look at something beautiful, it brings a direct, immediate feeling of life being furthered. Your imagination gets to engage in this restful, pleasant play.
But the sublime is the exact opposite. It is found in the formless. It's found in the boundless. While beauty is tied to quality and shape, the sublime is inextricably linked to sheer unadulterated quantity.
It is the difference between gazing at a perfectly manicured, enclosed Zen garden where your mind rests in its perfect arrangement versus standing on a cliff edge at midnight, staring out into a black, churning, limitless ocean.
Yeah, there are no edges. It actively defies your mind's ability to wrap around it. And because of that boundlessness, the psychological reaction is entirely different. The sublime does not bring us a gentle, positive pleasure.
The book introduces a haunting concept here called negative pleasure. Confronting the sublime is not a joyful, restful experience. It is a momentary, violent blocking of your vital powers.
It is as if your mind simply freezes, utterly overwhelmed by the scale or the raw power of what you are witnessing. But that freeze is immediately followed by a massive, powerful outflow of those same vital powers.
It produces admiration. It produces respect.
It does. The text goes so far as to say it seems to do violence to our imagination. And this brings us to what might be the most counterintuitive yet crucial insight in this entire section. The sublime does not actually exist in nature.
I have to push back on that, or at least play devil's advocate, because that feels completely backwards to human experience. If the sublime is only in my head, why do we all collectively feel it when we stand at the edge of the Grand Canyon? It feels very much like the canyon is doing the heavy lifting, not me.
It is a completely natural reaction to feel that way. We always say that mountain is sublime or that canyon is sublime, but the book insists we are expressing ourselves incorrectly.
Because the physical object, the rocks, the gap in the earth, the churning water cannot truly contain the sublime because nature is just matter.
Exactly. The ocean or the mountain is merely a catalyst. The true sublime exists only in our minds, specifically in our ideas of reason. When the sheer scale of the Grand Canyon violates your imagination's ability to comprehend it, the failure of your senses forces you to look inward.
You discover a sublimity within your own rational capacity.
Yes, and to map this out, the book divides the sublime into two distinct categories. The mathematically sublime, which deals with absolute immensity, and the dynamically sublime, which deals with absolute might.
Let us step into that first category, the mathematically sublime, covering sections 25 through 27. The book defines it simply as that which is absolutely great. Now, when we say a tree is tall or a building is great, there is always a hidden comparison happening.
It is tall compared to a person or to another tree.
Right, but the sublime isn't just comparatively great, it is great beyond all comparison.
To really grasp this, we have to look at the mechanics of how human beings measure the world. The text draws a line between mathematical estimation and aesthetical estimation.
Mathematical estimation uses numbers. And the defining trait of numbers is that they can go on infinitely. You can always add another zero. There is no maximum limit.
But aesthetical estimation is different. It is how we take in magnitude raw with the eye, with our intuition. When we estimate magnitude aesthetically, our imagination performs two actions: apprehension and comprehension.
Let me see if I can break those two down. Apprehension is just gathering the pieces. Looking at one stone, then the next stone, then the next. Like, numbers apprehension can theoretically go on forever.
It can. But comprehension is the act of holding all those individual apprehended pieces together in one single, unified mental image.
It is like picking up items at a grocery store without a basket. Apprehension is picking up the items one by one. Comprehension is trying to carry them all in your arms. Eventually, you hit a strict subjective maximum limit where you start dropping the first items to hold the new ones.
That is a brilliant way to visualize it. There is a breaking point. The text provides incredibly vivid examples of this mental collapse. It mentions Savory's observations of the pyramids of Egypt.
Right. If you stand too far away from the pyramids, the individual stones blur together. Your apprehension finds nothing specific to grasp, and you feel no emotional weight.
But if you stand too close teeth, your eye takes so long to travel from the base to the apex that by the time your imagination reaches the top, you have literally forgotten the visual apprehension of the bottom tiers. Your comprehension completely fails.
The book also notes the bewilderment a person feels upon walking into St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Your imagination strives to encompass the sheer volume of the space it hits, its absolute maximum limit, and it collapses back on itself.
And here is the beautiful paradox the book presents. Why does this failure, this dropping of the groceries, produce an emotional satisfaction? Why does the pain of our imagination failing to grasp the infinite actually bring us pleasure?
It brings us pleasure because that very inadequacy awakens our reason. Our mind listens to the voice of reason, which demands absolute totality.
When the imagination fruitlessly spends its entire faculty trying to comprehend the immeasurable, like trying to visualize the true size of the universe when looking at a deep field image from the James Webb Space Telescope, it fails. But that failure reveals to us that we possess a faculty of mind that surpasses every standard of sense.
The pain makes us realize that we have a supersensible destination. The mind experiences a rapid vibration, a quick oscillating alternation between being repelled by the terrifying abyss of the infinite and being attracted by the realization of our own rational power to actually think the concept of the infinite.
The telescope proves our physical world is just a speck of dust, rendering us infinitely small. But our reason can encompass the concept of the infinite universe itself, proving our cognitive superiority over the physical world.
It is a quiet, profound victory of the human mind. But we don't get to rest in that victory for long. Moving into section 28, the text shifts from the mathematically sublime to the dynamically sublime.
If the mathematical was about nature as an immeasurable size, the dynamical is about nature as an unstoppable, terrifying force. The book calls this might.
Yes, but specifically might that has no dominion over us. For nature to be dynamically sublime, it must be represented as exciting fear. It is a force that reveals our absolute physical impotence as fragile human beings.
But there's a massive structural caveat here. We cannot actually be in mortal peril. If you are drowning in a hurricane or running from a wildfire, you are not experiencing the sublime. You are just in a state of pure animal terror.
The modern equivalent that comes to mind is watching footage of a devastating tsunami or a violent tornado on a screen, or watching a real thunderstorm from behind a thick, unbreakable pane of soundproof glass. The fear, the deep understanding of the danger must be present in your thoughts, but you must be entirely safe.
The book is absolutely uncompromising on this point. It states that he who fears can no more judge of the sublime than he who is captured by appetite can judge of the beautiful.
Only when we are safe can we look at what the text describes as bold, overhanging, threatening rocks or storm clouds moving with lightning flashes and thunder peals, volcanoes and all their violence of destruction, the boundless, tumultuous ocean.
These sites exhibit our physical faculty of resistance as insignificantly small. We are biologically powerless. But just as the failure of imagination awakened our reason in the mathematically sublime, our physical helplessness in the dynamically sublime awakens a non-physical superiority within us.
It calls up a power in us that is not nature. We realize that our moral and spiritual destination is completely untouchable by physical distinction. We can be crushed physically by a falling rock or a tidal wave, but our humanity, our moral essence remains unhumiliated. It cannot be touched by weather.
Which brings us to a vital, piercing distinction the book makes regarding how we relate to the divine. It draws a sharp, unforgiving line between superstition and true religion.
Superstition is characterized by a cringing, prostrating fear accompanied by a desire to flatter a wrathful, all-powerful God. The superstitious person is merely terrified of a dynamically sublime force and is seeking favor to survive.
They're essentially trying to negotiate with a hurricane.
Precisely. But true appreciation of the divine sublime requires a completely different state of mind. It requires a mood of calm contemplation and free judgment.
It demands that we have an upright moral disposition. When we view the overwhelming might of nature or the concept of the divine through this lens, we don't see it as an outburst of wrath. Instead, we recognize our own inner moral sublimity that is conformable to the divine will.
We stand tall in our moral integrity rather than bowing in abject animal terror. Standing tall in the face of absolute power requires a significant level of internal development. And that leads directly into Section 29 and the general remark.
It forces us to ask, does everyone feel the sublime? The text states very clearly that experiencing the sublime requires a certain baseline of culture and moral feeling.
To an uneducated mind without developed moral ideas, the sublime just looks terrifying.
The text shares a very telling, almost humorous anecdote from the Alpine traveler Saussure. He speaks of a good, intelligent Savoyard peasant who looked at the mountain climbers risking their lives on the snow mountains and unhesitatingly called them absolute fools.
To the peasant, the mountains were just dangerous, miserable places. He did not have the cultural or moral framing to elevate that terror into the sublime. The judgment upon the sublime in nature needs culture far more than the judgment of the beautiful does.
And in this deep exploration of the general remark, the book takes aim at other theories of the time, most notably Edmund Burke's physiological theory.
To summarize Burke's view, he basically argued that the sublime is just the physical bodily relief you feel when a threat to your self-preservation passes. You were scared, now you are not, and the relief feels intense. It is like the feeling of taking off a pair of painfully tight shoes.
And he thought beauty was just the literal physical relaxing of bodily fibers. The text firmly, almost surgically rejects this purely empirical psychological approach.
While Burke's observations might be perfectly accurate as psychology, humans do feel bodily relief when danger passes. They fail entirely as philosophy. If the sublime and the beautiful are merely physical bodily reactions, just gratification or grief, then we could never demand that anyone else agree with our taste.
If I say something is beautiful because it relaxes my specific bodily fibers, I have no logical right to expect it to relax yours. The text insists that our aesthetic judgments must rest on an a priori principle, a universal structure built into the human mind before experience even happens. It must raise us out of mere biology.
The text then wanders into states of mind that border on the sublime, and it draws some fascinating lines. Take enthusiasm. Enthusiasm is when you are driven powerfully by ideas almost blindly.
The text says enthusiasm is aesthetically sublime because it shows a tension of forces produced by ideas, but it lacks the rational approval of free deliberation. What is truly noble, truly sublime in a far preferable way, is what the book calls apathy or phlegm.
Now, today we think of apathy as laziness or not caring, but here it means something entirely different. It means a calm, vigorous, unwavering adherence to your principles in the absence of wild, blinding emotion.
It is the triumph of pure reason over sensibility. The text uses this lens to look at religion and society in ways that are still striking today. It asserts that perhaps the most sublime passage in the Jewish law is the commandment against making graven images.
By stripping away any physical, sensible representation of the divine, it removes all physical limitations from the mind. It forces the imagination into an abstract, infinite space.
This purely negative presentation, this refusal to define the infinite with finite shapes, expands the soul and fundamentally prevents fanaticism. Fanaticism is a disease where the imagination loses all rules, but this negative presentation of morality is rooted in the impenetrable, formless idea of freedom.
This idea of mental freedom actually spills over into how we deal with other people, too. The book makes a very careful distinction between the sublime self-sufficiency of solitude and the contemptible nature of misanthropy.
To be sufficient for oneself to not need society without actively hating it borders on the sublime. But to flee from people because you fear them or bear ill will toward them is just hateful.
The text quotes Saussure again describing a mountain called Bonhomme, noting there reigns there a certain insipid sadness. It is a melancholy that comes from recognizing the evils human beings inflict upon each other and wishing to separate from the world not out of hate, but out of a sublime dedication to the idea of what humanity actually could be.
All of this rich, intricate exploration of our internal moral and aesthetic landscape sets the stage for the final and perhaps heaviest conceptual hurdle in this entire section, the deduction of judgments of taste, covering sections 30 through 33.
In philosophical terms, a deduction is a justification. We're asking, why do we need to justify our aesthetic judgments in the first place? The text points out something that feels surprising after all this discussion. The sublime actually needs no deduction.
It requires no justification. Why? Because when we experience the sublime, we aren't making a claim about the physical object itself. We already established that the sublime is entirely in us in our state of mind.
But the beautiful is different. The beautiful does need a deduction. When we point to a flower or a painting and say, this is beautiful, we are speaking as if beauty were an objective property of the object, like its physical weight or its color.
We are demanding that everyone else agree with us, even though the feeling of beauty is entirely subjective, occurring only within us. We are forced to justify how a purely subjective internal feeling can possibly claim universal validity.
To solve this, the text identifies two distinct, almost defiant logical peculiarities of the judgment of taste. The first peculiarity is autonomy.
When you make a judgment of taste, you must judge for yourself. You cannot simply imitate others. It is the absolute rejection of aesthetic peer pressure, which the text calls heteronomy. The text uses a wonderful, enduring example of a young poet.
There is a profound beauty in the example the text provides here. Imagine a young poet writes a poem. He reads it, and he feels deeply internally that it is beautiful. Then he shows it to his friends, and they hate it.
He shows it to the public and is universally panned. The critics tear it apart. Despite 100 voices telling him it is bad, he stands by his internal feeling. He refuses to let the public dictate his taste.
Taste claims total autonomy. Even the great classics of literature or art aren't meant to be rigid rules we blindly copy. They are simply models meant to inspire us to find the source of taste within our own autonomous minds.
Which leads directly into the second closely related peculiarity. A judgment of taste cannot be proven by logic or majority rule. There is no empirical ground of proof.
If 100 people tell you a building is beautiful and they map out the math of its architecture, their empirical agreement cannot force your internal aesthetic feeling. You cannot be argued or bullied into finding something beautiful.
A priori proofs, logical rules, or majority consensus are all completely, utterly useless if your own internal reflective judgment does not feel the harmony. You cannot be logically forced to appreciate the beautiful.
It leaves us in a state of profound isolation, but also profound sovereignty. We are entirely alone with our internal taste, refusing to bow to 100 dissenting voices.
Right. And at the same time, we have discovered that our reason stands completely superior to the terrifying might of hurricanes and the boundless abyss of the infinite universe.
But it also leaves you wondering, in an age where our screens constantly flood us with images of the most terrifying storms, the deepest parts of the cosmos, and the loudest critical opinions, have we numbed our ability to truly feel the sublime? Have we outsourced our autonomy to the crowd?
That's the question you are left sitting with.
And so as we hold on to this realization of our own profound internal independence, we must now carry this exact same quiet sovereignty forward, stepping into the next phase of the book where the very mechanics of nature's design await our gaze. And that brings us right to the threshold of the next phase of the argument, moving directly into these deeply fascinating rules about taste and beauty.
Right into the core of it.
Yeah, and if you are sitting quietly with us right now, listening to this, you might naturally assume, well, you might think beauty is something we can debate, measure, and eventually prove.
Like a complex math equation.
Exactly, like a math equation. But the philosophical journey we are on in the book right now suggests the exact opposite. We are looking at why beauty completely defies logical proof, the profound difference between art and nature, and the true, uncompromising definition of a genius.
It is a profound shift in how we think about our own perceptions. We're so conditioned to demand evidence for everything. You want a spreadsheet, a logical breakdown, a verifiable fact. But there is this incredibly vivid analogy presented in the book to show why there is no objective principle, no logical proof of taste. It uses the example of a chef.
The chef analogy, right? I think that makes this so wonderfully clear. Picture yourself sitting at a table, and a chef presents a dish to you. Now, this chef could stand there and enumerate every single ingredient.
Every single one.
They could give you the scientific breakdown of why the proteins are perfectly seared, why the chemical compounds of the spices are perfectly balanced, and why, logically and nutritionally, the food is undeniably delicious.
They can build an airtight, logical argument for the dish. But what do you actually do in that situation? You essentially stop your ears to their reasoning.
You just don't listen.
You listen to no arguments.
Yeah,
Because you cannot judge the food through someone else's logic.
right.
You pick up your fork, you take a bite, and you try the dish with your own tongue and your own palate.
Yeah.
Only then, in that immediate sensory moment, do you pass judgment. Your taste doesn't care about universal principles or deductions. It is entirely immediate.
That makes perfect sense for food, but how does that apply to something like looking at a flower? I mean, how is judging beauty different from just making a logical statement about the world?
That distinction between a logical judgment and a judgment of taste is crucial for you to grasp. Let's look at a flower, specifically a tulip. If you stand in a garden and say, all tulips are beautiful, you might think you are making a judgment of taste, but you aren't.
Because it's too broad.
Exactly. You're actually making a logical judgment. You are taking an object, comparing it to others, and creating a universal claim about an entire biological species. But if you walk over, snap a single specific tulip from the stem, hold it in your hand, look at its specific petals, and say, this individual tulip is beautiful.
That is a pure judgment of taste.
That is the judgment of taste.
Okay, let's unpack this slowly because I feel like this is where it gets incredibly paradoxical. When you hold that single tulip in your hand and you judge it as beautiful, your judgment is entirely subjective. It is based entirely on your personal, private feeling of pleasure in that exact moment. Yet, there is this beautiful contradiction. When you call it beautiful, you quietly demand that everyone else should agree with you. You make a claim for universal assent, exactly as if you were stating an objective fact that could be proven. Why do we do that? Why do I demand that you feel the same way I do about a flower?
It is a fascinating tension, isn't it?
Yeah.
You absolutely cannot prove it to anyone, yet you feel deep down that everyone ought to feel the same way. The explanation given in the book is that this happens through what is called a free play between two of our mental faculties, the imagination and the understanding.
So they are working together.
Yes. When you find something beautiful, your imagination is freely gathering the form of the object, and it happens to perfectly harmonize with your understanding. But, and this is key, it does this without actually locking into a strict logical concept. It is simply a feeling of deep cognitive harmony.
And because we all share those same faculties.
Precisely. We all have imagination and understanding, so you unconsciously assume that this harmony, this profound pleasure, must be universally communicable to every other human being.
That idea of universality is beautiful, but honestly, it sounds a bit impossible in practice. How can we possibly know what everyone else feels? That brings us to this elevated idea of a communal sense, right? And we need to be careful here, because the term common sense is used, but it definitely doesn't mean it in the vulgar, everyday way.
No, not like knowing not to touch a hot stove or look both ways before crossing the street.
Exactly. It elevates the term significantly. A communal sensus communis in this context is a faculty of judgment that takes into account, a priori, the perspectives of all humanity.
And by a priori, we mean preemptively, before you even form your thought or experience the specific object.
Right. It is a way of escaping our own private illusions. To do this, you compare your judgment not necessarily with the actual literal judgments of the people sitting next to you, but with the possible judgments of humanity at large. You put yourself in the place of any other person, consciously stripping away the highly personal, contingent limitations of your own senses.
Which is a monumental task.
It is. And how does one actually achieve that kind of perspective? There are three carefully outlined rules, or maxims, for this common human understanding provided in the book. Could you walk us through those?
Certainly. The first maxim is to think for oneself. This is the maxim of an unprejudiced mind, a mind completely free from superstition. The argument here is that the greatest superstition of all is thinking nature isn't subject to rules. Deliverance from that specific blindness is true enlightenment. You have to use your own reason.
And the second maxim.
The second is to put ourselves in thought in the place of everyone else. This is the maxim of enlarged thought. You must actively detach from your private subjective conditions, all those little personal biases and local customs that confine so many of us, and attempt to look at things from a broad universal standpoint.
Which leads to the third maxim, which is to always think consistently. And there's a warning here that this is the absolute hardest of all to attain. You only reach it by mastering the first two maxims and making them a constant, rigorous habit. What's deeply compelling to me is how all of this abstract thought connects directly back to beauty. Taste, ultimately, is presented as the true communal sense.
The true communal sense.
Yeah, taste is the very ability to judge what makes our inner feelings universally communicable without needing a rigid rule to force agreement.
It is the bridge between our private inner world and the shared human experience.
So if we take all this out of the abstract, how does this actually play out when we interact with beauty in our daily lives? There's a sharp, quiet line drawn between two types of interest we take in beauty: empirical and intellectual. Let's start with empirical. From an empirical standpoint, beauty only really seems to matter in society.
Yes. The empirical interest in beauty is deeply, undeniably intertwined with sociability and eventually vanity. Think about the desert island scenario. If you were entirely alone, shipwrecked on a deserted island, you wouldn't bother planting ornamental flowers perfectly spaced around your little hut. You certainly wouldn't spend hours decorating yourself or refining your clothes.
Right. There are fascinating historical examples given in the book to illustrate this. It mentions indigenous tribes, like the Caribs using ruku to dye their skin red, or the Iroquois using cinnabar. They adorn their canoes, their clothes, things that provide absolutely no physical gratification.
The painted wood doesn't make the canoe float any better.
Exactly. But it is vital socially. Over time, as civilization reaches its peak, this refinement snowballs into a massive social vanity. We value these beautiful sensations almost entirely because we can communicate them to others. We want to be seen having good taste.
But then, we contrast that with the intellectual interest in beauty, which is presented in such a striking, elevated way. The book argues that having an immediate, purely intellectual interest in the beauty of nature is the mark of a truly good moral soul. This isn't about society. This isn't about vanity or showing off.
Picture yourself completely alone in the deep woods. You stumble across the delicate, intricate shape of a wild flower, or a bird resting on a branch, or even the geometric perfection of an insect. You aren't asking for any advantage from it. You can't eat it. You don't want to harvest it. And because you are alone, you don't even want to show it to anyone to prove your refined taste. Its mere existence pleases you profoundly.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it reveals a profound link between our aesthetic appreciation and our moral disposition.
Yeah.
To love nature for its own sake is a morally good posture. But there is a very strict, crucial condition for this intellectual interest.
What is that?
The beauty must be nature, or we must at least firmly believe it to be nature.
And what happens if it isn't?
The charm breaks entirely. There's a wonderful specific example of this deception. Imagine a lover of nature discovers a beautiful flower blooming in the ground. They feel that pure intellectual delight we just described. But if they lean in closer and suddenly realize the flower is a perfect artificial fake, maybe silk or carefully painted wax, or that the bird on the branch is actually intricately carved wood, that immediate pure interest vanishes in an instant. The feeling just evaporates.
I have to admit, I quietly chuckled at the anecdote about the mischievous boy. It so perfectly illustrates this point. You have to picture a merry host entertaining his wealthy, aristocratic guests at a country estate on a still summer evening. Everything is bathed in moonlight. Suddenly, everyone falls silent, completely enchanted by the bewitching, melancholic song of a nightingale echoing from a lonely copse of trees. They are having this profound, elevated aesthetic experience.
But it turns out, the host has tricked them.
He absolutely tricked them. He hid a mischievous teenage boy in the bushes who knew how to perfectly mimic the nightingale using a reed or a tube. You can just imagine the profound irritation of these guests when they realized they were getting deeply emotional over a teenager blowing into a piece of grass.
The spell is broken.
Utterly broken. The moment they realize it is a human trick, a contrivance, the charm is dead. No one wants to listen to it anymore. To touch that deep moral core within us, the beauty cannot be an intentional deception of art.
It naturally brings us to a very necessary distinction. If art is a contrivance, how do we carefully define what art actually is compared to nature, science, and craft?
All right.
First, art is distinguished from nature because art requires freedom and a rational will.
Right, like the bee building a honeycomb. It's incredibly intricate, geometrically stunning, and we might casually call it a work of art by analogy. But because the bee is driven entirely by instinct, without rational deliberation or free choice, the honeycomb is purely a product of nature.
Yes. Whereas if you are digging in a bog and you unearth a piece of carved wood, you immediately know it is art. A rational purpose, a human will shaped it, even if it's crude.
The book also meticulously separates art from science. Knowing is simply not the same as doing. There is the example of Camper. Camper could describe, with perfect scientific and theoretical precision, exactly how the best shoes must be made. He understood the anatomy of the foot, the stress points of the leather, he had all the knowledge.
But he could not actually sit down at a bench and make a shoe himself. Science is the theory. Art is the skill, the practical, physical execution.
Okay, but what about free art versus, say, making a living? The text distinguishes free art from mercenary art, which it calls handicraft. Free art is described as play. It is pleasant in itself. You engage in it freely without compulsion. Mercenary art, or labor, is unpleasant in itself. It is compulsory, and it is only attractive because of the effect it produces, like the wage you earn from doing it.
And that's an important categorization. It categorizes the motive and the nature of the activity itself. When the primary driver is the wage, the activity is constrained by the demands of the market or the employer. It loses that spontaneous free play. However, there is a quiet caveat added. Even free art requires some level of constraint or mechanism.
That's true. Think of poetry. To be beautiful, poetry needs the constraint of meter and prosody, the rules of rhythm and sound. Without that physical mechanism, that resistance, the spirit of the art would have no body. It would just evaporate into nothing.
And this leads to one of the most vital rules regarding beautiful art. A product of beautiful art must look as free from arbitrary rules as if it were a product of pure nature. When you look at a masterpiece, you must be conscious that it is art, but the purposiveness in its form must not seem labored or painfully deliberate. It cannot show the sweat of the artist. It must feel as effortless and natural as a leaf growing on a tree.
Which brings us to the concept of a genius. We throw that word around so casually. Today we call athletes geniuses, programmers geniuses. How is it defined here in this specific philosophical framework?
The book defines it very specifically. Genius is the innate mental disposition through which nature gives the rule to art.
So they don't invent the rules logically.
Exactly. Beautiful art cannot be derived from a strict rule or a mathematical formula. If it could, anyone could learn it, memorize it, and replicate it scientifically. Because there is no formula, the rule for creating beautiful art must come from nature itself, channeled unconsciously through the harmony of the faculties within the artist. Therefore, beautiful art is only possible as a product of genius.
And the most defining characteristic of this genius seems to be its inexplicability. A genius cannot scientifically explain how they create their ideas. I love the comparison drawn between the scientist and the poet here. You can learn absolutely everything that Isaac Newton discovered in his monumental principles of natural philosophy. You can learn it because Newton can lay out the exact logical mathematical steps he took to get there. He can teach it to you.
But a great poet cannot teach you how to write spirited poetry. The poet doesn't even know how the ideas arrive. They spring from that innate disposition. And because it cannot be taught through precepts, the talent simply dies with the artist, resting in the earth until nature gives it to someone else.
So if a genius can't teach us, what do they leave behind? Just models.
Yes, their products become models. They are not meant to be slavishly copied, which would just be aping a hollow imitation but followed. The model awakens another genius to a feeling of their own originality.
But I have to play devil's advocate for a moment. If genius is this incredible, rare gift from nature, shouldn't it just run wild? Why do we need anything else? The book introduces this quiet battle between genius and taste. Genius provides the rich, wild, abundant material, the boundless originality, but taste is the discipline. Taste clips the wings of genius. Why clip the wings?
Because lawless freedom of the imagination produces only original nonsense. Taste is what polishes that wildness. It brings order to the multitude of thoughts and makes those wild ideas universally communicable. If a sacrifice must be made in a work of art, the book argues it is far better to sacrifice some of that genius than to abandon taste. Taste ensures the imagination actually aligns with the understanding, making the art accessible to humanity rather than just a private madness.
So if taste is the discipline that keeps things in check, what is the spirit? You sometimes read a poem or listen to a speech, and it is perfectly neat, elegant, perfectly acceptable to taste, but you say it lacks spirit. What is missing?
Spirit, in this aesthetical sense, is the animating principle of the mind. And this spirit is fundamentally the faculty of presenting what are called aesthetical ideas. An aesthetical idea is a representation of the imagination that provokes an endless amount of thought. It occasions so much contemplation that no specific language, no definite concept can ever fully capture it or make it completely intelligible. It stretches the mind far beyond the bounds of ordinary experience.
To make this abstract idea relatable, let's look at the specific visual and poetic attributes mentioned. Think of Jupiter's eagle clutching lightning in its claws, or the majestic peacock associated with the Queen of Heaven. These aren't logical attributes. They don't just state a historical or biological fact about the gods. They are aesthetical attributes that stimulate the imagination to spread over a vast field of kindred representations, provoking way more thought than a mere literal word could hold.
The poetic examples provided are incredibly moving illustrations of this. The first is a poem by a great king. In it, he compares the end of a life leaving the world filled with good deeds, to a summer sun setting. The poem describes the sun leaving a gentle light on the horizon, its last rays being its last sighs given to the universe.
It's a gorgeous image.
It is. This comparison connects the physical, visual beauty of a serene summer evening with the highly abstract, rational idea of a peaceful, well-lived life. It creates a wealth of feeling that no single word could ever express.
The second example is just a few lines from a poet describing a sunrise. The sun arose, as calm from virtue springs. Just sit with that for a moment, connecting the physical reality of the morning sun rising over the horizon to the quiet, abstract consciousness of human virtue. It diffuses a boundless prospect of restful feelings in the reader's mind. By placing these two things together, the poet uses an aesthetical idea to create an unmeasurable depth of peaceful, sublime feeling.
It really is the pinnacle of what art can achieve. And understanding how these different forms of expression work leads us to how the beautiful arts are systematically divided. They're categorized based on the three ways humans naturally communicate: through words, through gestures, and through tones.
Let's map this out. The first category is the arts of speech, which includes rhetoric and poetry. And there is a fascinating distinction made here. Rhetoric, the art of the orator, is described as treating a serious business of the understanding as if it were a free play of the imagination.
Rhetoric almost seems a bit deceptive in this light.
Exactly. It promises a serious truth, but in the end, it only gives you a play of ideas to entertain or persuade you, often manipulating your feelings. Poetry, on the other hand, does the exact opposite. Poetry promises mere play, an entertaining dance of words and meter. But it actually delivers profound food for the understanding. It quickens the mind. For this reason, poetry is ranked in the book as the absolute highest of all the beautiful arts.
The second category is the formative arts, which express ideas through sensible intuition, meaning things occupying physical space. This is divided into plastic arts and painting. Plastic arts deal with physical reality and corporeal truth, things you can actually reach out and touch, like sculpture and architecture. Painting deals with sensible illusion. It creates appearances purely for the eye. Interestingly, landscape gardening is placed under the category of painting.
Really? Because you can physically touch a garden?
You can, but the art of it, the intentional arrangement of nature's products, the sloping hills, the placement of trees, is done entirely for the visual entertainment of the imagination, framing an illusion of perfected nature for the eye.
That makes a lot of sense. The third and final category is the play of sensations, externally stimulated. This encompasses music and the art of color, and there is a very quiet, profound debate presented about how to classify these. Are music and color merely pleasant physical vibrations hitting our nervous system? Meaning, are they just arts of fleeting enjoyment? Or is the human mind actually unconsciously judging the mathematical form, the exact time intervals, and the precise proportions of those vibrations?
It's a vital distinction.
Right.
Because if it's the latter, if the mind is actively, mathematically judging the form of the play of sensations without us even realizing it, then music and color are elevated from mere physical pleasantries to true beautiful art. It's a delicate, beautiful balance between sensory pleasure and rigorous cognitive reflection.
And as we reflect on all these profound categorizations, the nature of genius and the unexplainable power of a single tulip, we arrive at a very solemn warning. It is suggested that if the beautiful arts are not eventually combined with moral ideas, they become mere distractions. We end up using them simply to disperse our own discontent. We use beauty as a fleeting, hollow escape, which ultimately leaves us ever more useless and ever more dissatisfied with ourselves.
It is a sobering realization. We are asked to see that poetry and the pure intellectual beauty of nature are meant to elevate us far above mere distraction, connecting our aesthetic pleasure to the ultimate moral purpose of our being.
And as we carry this understanding of poetry's power and our moral connection to beauty forward, we have to ask ourselves how these very concepts shape what we encounter in the next turning of the page. And stepping right back into that thought, we find ourselves returning to the quiet, unfolding landscape of Immanuel Kant's Critique of Judgment.
It really is a vast space to explore.
It is, yeah. Sitting here, just turning these pages together with you in the stillness of this moment, we're about to venture into some truly profound and almost hidden territory.
The kind of territory that requires a lot of patience.
Exactly. Our mission as we continue this journey together is to gently unpack how art subtly manipulates us, to examine the hidden biological mechanics of what makes a good joke actually work.
Which is fascinating, by the
Oh,
way.
completely. And then we need to confront the ultimate paradox of human taste and look really closely at the beautiful illusion of design in the natural world around us. So, okay, let's unpack this.
Where should we begin?
Let's start with how the book ranks the arts, because there's this rather stark warning. It issues about the ethics of persuasion.
Right. It's a delicate place to begin, but an essential one. The text draws a very sharp line between eloquence, what we might call rhetoric, and poetry.
And we usually admire eloquence, don't we?
We do. When we think about eloquence, especially in the context of, civil law or a powerful speech from a pulpit, we view it as a high art. But here in the book, rhetoric is viewed with a deep, profound suspicion.
Because it's manipulative.
Exactly. It is essentially framed as manipulation. It uses the exuberance of wit and imagination to captivate you, and in doing so, it subtly robs you of your freedom of judgment.
And just to push back slightly, couldn't you argue that a persuasive, beautifully crafted speech is a masterpiece? I mean, if someone can move a crowd to do something good, isn't that a high cultural achievement?
It is powerful, undoubtedly.
Yeah.
But the philosophy here argues that this power is exactly the problem when it comes to free intellectual culture. When you are deciding a matter of rights, or trying to understand your moral duty, being talked over or charmed by a speaker is almost an insult to the seriousness of the business at hand.
Because you're being bypassed.
Right. You shouldn't do what is right, because someone painted a pretty emotional picture that bypassed your logic. You should do it solely because it is right. Rhetoric hides its intentions behind a beautiful mask.
I see. It treats you, the listener, as an instrument to be played. But poetry, the argument goes, is entirely honest.
Yes, poetry walks into the room and announces itself from the start as a mere play of the imagination.
It doesn't try to sneak past your understanding or ensnare your logic under the guise of objective truth. It's just candid. It offers itself for your contemplation without demanding your agreement on matters of real-world consequence.
And speaking of art forms that enter the room and affect us, we really have to look at the perspective on music.
Oh, this is where the hierarchy gets very specific.
Very. Music is placed incredibly high on the scale of bodily pleasantness, but is actually ranked the lowest when it comes to intellectual culture.
Which sounds harsh at first.
It does. But music speaks entirely through sensations without concepts. It washes over you. It moves the mind intensely in a huge variety of ways, but only transitorily.
Because it doesn't leave anything over for quiet reflection. There are no concepts to turn over in your mind after the sound fades.
Exactly. So it is considered more about enjoyment than actual lasting culture. The play of thought it excites is just mechanical association. But the truly fascinating critique here is the assertion that music inherently lacks urbanity.
The perfume analogy.
Yes.
I find this specific detail so incredibly striking, and it really grounds the concept for me. The argument is that music lacks manners, essentially, because it imposes itself on others. It spreads out, much like a very strong smell.
It's an aggressive medium.
Right. So imagine you are sitting in a crowded, quiet room, perhaps reading or in deep thought, and a man nearby suddenly pulls a heavily perfumed handkerchief from his pocket. He forces everyone around him to breathe it in, even against their will, simply because they must take a breath to live, they have to partake in his enjoyment of the scent.
It's inescapable.
Music operates the exact same way. It penetrates walls and spaces. It does violence to the freedom of anyone nearby who isn't part of the musical company. You simply cannot close your ears the way you can close your eyes.
Which is precisely why the ultimate palm of supremacy is given to painting and to the visual arts in general.
Because you have a choice.
Exactly. With a painting, if you do not wish to be impressed by it, you simply look away. Your personal freedom remains entirely intact. Furthermore, painting can penetrate much further into the region of ideas. It extends the field of intuition in a permanent way, leaving you with something lasting to contemplate, rather than a fleeting physical vibration in the air.
And that concept of physical vibration provides such a natural bridge into the distinction made between true aesthetic satisfaction and mere bodily gratification. It brings up Epicurus, the ancient philosopher who famously suggested that all gratification is, at bottom, just bodily sensation.
It is a vital distinction to sit with. True aesthetic satisfaction, the kind we find in the beautiful, involves our higher faculties. Gratification, on the other hand, is intimately tied to the feeling of the furtherance of your life, your bodily well-being.
But Epicurus missed something, didn't he?
He did.
Yeah.
Bodily gratification isn't just about food or survival. Sometimes the most intense physical release comes from the mind being tricked or engaged in a meaningless loop. Think about evening parties where people play games of chance.
Right, like sitting around a casino table.
Yeah. It isn't a beautiful experience. It is just a play of affections. Your mind rapidly oscillates between hope, fear, joy, and wrath with every turn of a card.
So the mental tension actually manifests physically.
Precisely. This rapid changing of emotions creates a kind of internal motion in your body. It quite literally promotes the vital processes aiding the organs and digestion. You haven't learned anything, you haven't engaged with transcendent beauty, but you walk away feeling physically invigorated because your internal systems were given a workout by your oscillating emotions.
Which leads us into what is perhaps one of the most brilliant clinical definitions of humor I have ever encountered in the book, the anatomy of laughter.
It's so mechanical.
It really is. A convulsive laugh is defined here as, and this is the exact phrase, an affection arising from the sudden transformation of a strained expectation into nothing.
Not into the opposite of what you expected.
Right, but into nothing.
What is fascinating here is the sheer mechanics of that nothingness. Let's look at the specific historical examples used in the book to illustrate this.
Okay, I love these. The first one is the Indian and the beer.
Yes. So imagine an Indian man, centuries ago, sitting at an Englishman's table in the bustling city of Surat. The Englishman opens a bottle of ale, and all the carbonated beer turns into froth and violently overflows the glass.
And the Indian man is just watching this.
With absolute wide-eyed astonishment. So the Englishman asks, what is there in this to astonish you so much? And the Indian man replies, I am not at all astonished that it should flow out, but I do wonder how you ever got it in.
It's so good. So the mind builds up this tension. We expect him to be amazed by the chemical reaction or the physics of the expanding foam, but his logic is focused on the completely wrong end of the process. The logic just evaporates.
Exactly. Our understanding finds no satisfaction in the logic of the punchline. Because there is no logic, it transforms our strained expectation into nothing.
And then there's the second story, the merchant's wig.
Right. Imagine a group of people sitting together and someone tells a deeply tragic tale of people whose hair turned gray overnight from immense grief. We listen, our minds straining with empathy and perhaps a bit of skepticism.
Building that expectation again.
Yes. Then a wag in the group, sensing the heavy mood, chimes in. He describes very circumstantially a merchant returning from India with his entire wealth tied up in merchandise. A heavy storm hits, the ship is going down, and the merchant is forced to throw his entire fortune overboard.
Yay.
He grieves so intensely that
His hair turns gray instantly, too.
No. He grieves so intensely that his wig turns gray the exact same night.
His wig, that is just, it's total absurdity.
It is a total absurdity. And if we connect this back to the bigger picture of bodily health we just talked about, we see why we laugh so hard at the graying wig. If the expectation just turned into a lie, if the storyteller just said, well, I made it up, we would feel displeasure.
Because that would be transforming the expectation into the opposite.
Right. But the wig turning gray breaks the mind's tension sharply, because the mind realizes it was tricked by a mere play of representations. It rapidly oscillates back and forth, trying to reevaluate the illusion.
And that mental bouncing actually communicates itself to the body.
It does. It causes an alternating tension and relaxation of the elastic portions of our intestines, which then communicates itself to the diaphragm. The lungs expel air in rapid intervals. We're essentially reaching the body through the soul, using the mind's realization of absurdity as a physician for our physical organs.
That is such a vivid, almost mechanical way to look at joy. And it brings up this beautiful adjacent concept in the book about naivete.
It's a very tender observation.
It is. Imagine you are at one of these polite, highly structured evening gatherings. Everyone is surrounded by the commonplace, artificial manners used to make a fair show of themselves, and then suddenly, someone speaks with absolute, unspoiled, innocent sincerity.
They simply don't understand how to dissemble or fake it.
Yeah, it creates a very specific, quiet kind of delight. We laugh at their simplicity, at their inability to play the societal game, but at the very same time, we deeply respect them for it. It is the original sincerity of human nature breaking through the second nature of artificiality. It warms us.
And closely related to that warmth is the strict definition of humor. It is not just about being a moody person, what is termed here as being involuntarily subject to mutations.
Right, it's not just a mood swing.
No, true humor is framed as a voluntary talent. It is the deliberate ability to intentionally shift your own mental disposition, to look at things from a completely reversed, yet still entirely rational perspective, simply to create a lively, contrasting presentation of the world.
But as we delve into these subjective judgments, what is funny, what is charming, what is beautiful, we inevitably run into a massive intellectual wall. This is presented as the ultimate antinomy or paradox of taste.
The great conflict.
Let's quietly lay out this conflict because it is something every single one of you listening experiences. On one hand, we have the thesis. Everyone has their own taste. When I look at a painting and say it is beautiful, I cannot mathematically prove it to you using concepts or logic. Because it is not based on objective concepts, I logically shouldn't be able to demand that you agree with me.
That's the subjective side.
Right. But on the other hand, we have the antithesis. We argue and quarrel about taste all the time. Think about it. When you tell someone about a movie that deeply moved you and they respond that they thought it was utter garbage, you feel a spark of real indignation.
You feel personally offended.
Exactly. You don't just think, oh, well, different strokes for different folks. You secretly think they are wrong. The fact that we argue implies that there is some underlying standard we expect everyone to share. So, which is it? Is taste entirely personal, or is there a universal rule?
It is a knot that requires a very careful untangling. Both of those statements are actually true, but they're talking about two entirely different kinds of concepts. The thesis is correct that taste is not based on determinate concepts, things we can measure, prove, and define like a mathematical equation or a scientific law.
Okay.
But the antithesis is also correct because taste does rely on a concept, just an indeterminate one.
An indeterminate concept. That feels incredibly vast. What exactly does that mean in our daily lives?
It is referred to as the supersensible substrate of humanity.
The supersensible substrate.
Yes. Think of it as an invisible underlying network that connects human consciousness, a pure rational concept that underlies our shared nature, existing somewhere beyond our physical senses. We can never fully understand it, and we certainly can never prove it logically. But we absolutely must assume it exists.
Because if we don't assume this shared unseen substrate, we simply cannot explain why human beings desperately crave validation for their aesthetic choices.
Exactly. When you stand before a breathtaking mountain range and feel awe, you don't just feel it in isolation.
Yeah.
You feel a deep, undeniable conviction that every other human being who stands on that cliff ought to feel the exact same awe. We are appealing to that deep, invisible connection between all of us.
We assume we're all wired to the same unseen emotional motherboard, which naturally bridges into the technical distinction between different kinds of ideas and helps explain the very nature of artistic genius in the book. Let's talk about the difference between a feeling you can't put into words and a word you can't put into a picture.
A very poetic way to frame it.
The philosophy distinguishes between aesthetical ideas and rational ideas. An aesthetical idea is an intuition of the imagination that is so incredibly rich, so overflowing with meaning, that no language or concept can ever fully capture it. It is inexponable.
Meaning it literally cannot be exposed or explained entirely by language. It is like trying to describe the precise emotional weight of a nostalgic memory. The words always fall short of the internal image.
And on the flip side,
conversely, a rational idea is a concept of reason, like the concept of absolute freedom or eternity or God. These are concepts that are so vast, so transcendent, that no physical intuition or earthly image could ever adequately represent them. They are indemonstrable.
You cannot put freedom on a table and point to it.
Right. You cannot paint a picture of eternity without it just being a symbol.
So when we talk about a true artistic genius, we aren't just talking about someone with immaculate technique who studied brushstrokes for 10 years. Genius is defined here as the faculty of aesthetical ideas. A genius doesn't sit down and follow a rigid set of rules or a textbook to create art.
No, instead, nature itself acts through the genius. It bypasses conscious mechanical rules, acting through that supersensible substrate we just discussed, to produce something of original, inexplicable beauty. The genius gives the rule to art, rather than following a rule.
Which brings us to a profound observation about the natural world itself. When we step outside and look at nature, the exquisite, harmonious colors of a pheasant's plumage, the delicate mathematical spiral of a seashell, the breathtaking, intricate form of a flower, it is incredibly tempting to fall into what the book calls the realism of purposiveness.
It feels as though nature has intentionally, consciously designed these things with the express purpose of pleasing human eyes.
It really does. You look at a blossoming garden or a pristine coral reef, and your immediate instinct is to think, this was made for me to enjoy. This is art.
But there is a quiet yet incredibly firm counterargument presented here. Idealism. It argues that nature operates on blind mechanical chemical laws.
Okay, walk me through that.
Consider water freezing. When the temperature drops, water doesn't gradually get thick and viscous. It freezes rapidly, in a sudden leap, forming icicles that combine at perfect 60-degree angles. Look at the miraculous geometric perfection of snowflakes forming in the atmosphere, or the way trickling mineral water slowly builds the stunning complex formations inside the cavern of Antiparos.
So it's literally just fluid dynamics and chemistry at work. There's no conscious artist carving the snowflake.
Exactly. The purpose isn't actually sitting there inside the snowflake. The snowflake is just water and cold interacting under universal laws. The purpose, the beauty, is entirely a subjective lens in the human mind. Because our minds naturally seek order and symmetry and harmony, we project that purposiveness onto the snowflake.
We bring the beauty to nature. Nature does not hand it to us. That is such a deeply humbling thought, to realize that the universe is just doing what it does mechanically, and we are the ones painting meaning onto it. And this leads us to one of the most profound ideas we've encountered so far. How do we represent invisible concepts? There is a distinction made between using schemata for direct presentations and using symbols for indirect analogical presentations.
Yes, the political analogy used in the book to explain this is striking. How do you represent a despotic state?
Yeah.
You can't draw despotism directly.
Right.
So you use a symbol, a mechanical hand mill. It's rigid, lifeless, grinding everything down uniformly without thought or feeling. But to represent a monarchical state governed by living national laws, you would use the symbol of a living, breathing body.
The handmill physically looks nothing like a state.
No, but the rules of how a handmill operates, blind mechanical force, are perfectly analogous to how a despotic state operates. We use the symbol to map the relationship.
And using that framework of symbols, the grand reveal is made. The beautiful is the symbol of the morally good.
It's quite a statement.
Just let that resonate for a moment. Our experience of beauty is intimately, structurally tied to our capacity for morality.
There are 4 distinct parallels, detailed to prove this connection. First, both the beautiful and the morally good please us immediately, without us having to calculate an outcome or a consequence. Second, both please us without any self-interest. You don't love a beautiful sunset because it pays you money or elevates your status, just as you shouldn't do a good deed simply for a reward.
Third, both involve a profound sense of freedom that harmonizes with the law. In judging beauty, our imagination wanders freely, but still harmonizes with our understanding. In morality, our will is free, but harmonizes with the universal law of reason.
And fourth, both claim universal validity. As we discussed earlier, we expect everyone to agree on what is beautiful, just as we expect everyone to agree on what is morally right.
Because of this deep structural connection, we naturally project moral traits onto the physical world. We look at a towering oak tree and call it majestic. We see a sunlit valley and call it a laughing landscape. We look at soft pastel colors and call them innocent. Taste is the bridge. It makes the gentle transition possible from the raw charms of our physical senses to a habitual moral interest in the world around us.
So if you want to truly cultivate taste, the true preparation, the propedeutic, isn't found in memorizing lists of aesthetic rules.
Or studying art history.
Right. It is found in cultivating your moral feeling, It is found in developing our humaniora, our social spirit, our capacity to feel genuine sympathy, and our ability to universally communicate our innermost feelings with one another. To be a better judge of beauty, you must become a more empathetic human.
This naturally leads us to the final major theme of our current reflection teleological judgment and the dangerous trap of utility. We have to be very careful about how we assign purpose to the physical world.
We do. We can talk about formal purposiveness using geometry. Think of drawing a simple circle. From that one simple rule of construction, a mathematician can effortlessly solve an infinite number of complex problems involving triangles and intersecting chords. The circle wasn't consciously designed to solve those specific complex problems. The utility just flows naturally from its pure geometric perfection.
But then we look at the messy, chaotic real world and we see what is called material purpose, or relative utility. There are these incredible pictures painted of ecosystems in the book. Rivers constantly wash soil down from the mountains, depositing it at their mouths to create fertile land. The retreating sea leaves behind vast tracts of sandy soil, which happens to be the absolute perfect environment for pine forests to grow.
Or consider the example of the Laplander living in the freezing northern regions. The snow protects the crops from frost and allows the Laplander to travel easily by sleigh. And there, in that frozen landscape, they find the reindeer, an animal that can miraculously survive by scratching dry moss from beneath the snow, and which is easily tamed to pull those sleighs.
It looks like a wondrously perfectly designed system of utility. Think about how we do this today. We watch a perfectly balanced ecosystem in a nature documentary and think, wow, everything is perfectly designed to support the humans living there.
But there is a very quiet, very firm warning issued here. It is the flaw in teleology. Just because the reindeer and the snow are incredibly useful to the Laplander, we cannot arrogantly assume that nature's ultimate divine goal was to force human beings to live in a freezing, inhospitable wasteland, and thus it provided reindeer to make it possible.
That would be twisting the narrative.
Precisely. If we assume the sand was put there for the pine trees or the reindeer were created for the Laplander, we are just borrowing a concept from human art, where we build specific tools for specific jobs, and carelessly pasting it over nature. Relative utility is just an analogy we use to try and make sense of the world.
It is not a definitive proof of divine intentional design.
No, we use it to guide our observation, to categorize things, but we must never confuse our subjective need to see purpose with an objective reality in the things themselves.
Yeah. It really makes you pause.
It does, and it raises an important question, one we should perhaps just sit quietly with. If the geometric beauty of the snowflake is truly just an illusion projected by our own minds onto fluid dynamics, and if the reindeer's perfect utility for survival in the snow is just a lucky biological accident of intersecting natural laws.
What does that make us?
Exactly. Are humans merely another mechanical byproduct of this blind, grinding nature? Or is there something profoundly, fundamentally different about a creature that is even capable of sitting in the dark and asking these very questions?
It makes you wonder about the very core of our existence. We'll need to look much closer at that, at the peculiar character of things as natural purposes, and how we ourselves fit into that intricate, unspooling web. Imagine you are walking alone on a vast, seemingly uninhabited beach.
Just the sound of the rhythmic, soothing crash of the waves.
Right. The waves, the gentle rustle of the wind. And as you walk, looking down at the pristine, untouched sand, you suddenly stop.
Because right there, drawn perfectly in the grains of sand, is a regular hexagon.
You know instantly, without a shadow of a doubt, that the wind didn't do that. It didn't blow the sand into that precise geometric shape.
No, and the ocean waves didn't just wash ashore and accidentally leave behind such flawless mathematical symmetry.
You recognize immediately that this shape is the product of reason. Someone or some mind was here. You are forced to look at that sand and assume a purpose behind its arrangement.
It's a really profound thought to sit with, and it perfectly sets the stage for our quiet exploration today.
Yes, we are unpacking the notes, the research, the profound insights of a monumental book that fundamentally shifted how humanity views nature and meaning. We're looking at Immanuel Kant's Critique of Judgment.
And we're going to gently navigate a highly specific question this book poses. Because, if a simple hexagon in the sand screams of reason and design, how do we look at the natural world?
Exactly. Nature is infinitely more complex than a geometric shape on a beach.
It is a profound mystery. And to really grasp how this text approaches that mystery, we need to understand what it calls a natural purpose.
Which means we need to gently shift our gaze away from grand, sweeping landscapes. The book asks you to just look at a tree.
Just a common, everyday tree outside your window.
Yeah.
The book uses this humble organism to demonstrate a miracle of self-generation. It breaks it down into three distinct, quiet marvels.
The first is generic reproduction. Simply put, a tree generates another tree of the exact same genus.
It is, as an effect, continually produced, and as a cause, it continually produces itself, perpetuating its own kind in this endless cycle.
And what's fascinating is that the second marvel happens right in front of us every day, though we rarely think about it. The tree produces itself as an individual through what we simply call growth.
But we have to be really careful here because the book makes a strict distinction between this kind of growth and mere mechanical increase.
Right, think of a stalactite in a cave or a crystal forming. Those grow by just mechanically gathering matter and stacking it up layer by layer.
Precisely. A tree does not do that. When a tree takes in water, air, and soil, it doesn't just pile those elements on top of each other.
It takes raw external material and entirely transforms it into something utterly new, its own uniquely specific living tissue.
It develops itself by means of a material that it has, in a way, compounded itself. It takes the lifeless elements of the earth and weaves them into wood, sap, and leaf.
And the text notes that this separating and formative power is infinitely beyond the reach of human art. You cannot take the dissected chemical elements of a tree,
Put them in a laboratory, and simply reconstruct a living one.
which perfectly sets up the third marvel of the tree, the mutual dependence of its parts. Every single part of the tree generates itself in such a way that the maintenance of any one part depends reciprocally on the maintenance of the rest.
Consider the ancient art of grafting. You can take a bud or a twig from one tree, graft it onto a completely foreign stem, and it will survive and produce a plant of its own kind.
In this light, every single twig or leaf on a tree can be seen as an independent entity, grafted onto the whole, parasitically nourished by it.
Yet, it is a perfectly reciprocal relationship. The leaves are produced by the tree, yes, but those same leaves gather the sunlight that sustains the tree.
If you strip a tree of its leaves repeatedly, the tree will die. The parts are both the cause and the effect of their own form.
In nature, the organism is the cause and the effect of itself.
But wait, how is a tree really that different from a highly complex machine? I mean, if I look at a finely crafted Swiss pocket watch, that is also full of mutually dependent parts, isn't it?
It is.
The gears rely on the springs, the hands rely on the gears.
It's a brilliant comparison, and the book uses that exact analogy of the watch to draw a crucial boundary. Picture that pocket watch resting in your hand. Inside, one gear moves another gear. The motion is transferred perfectly, but one gear does not build another gear.
Ah, a watch cannot assemble other watches.
Exactly. If a brass gear is missing, the watch cannot extract raw metal from the surrounding air and grow a replacement. If a spring breaks, the watch cannot heal itself.
Right, because the producing cause of the watch's parts, the watchmaker, is entirely external to the material. The watch itself only has moving power.
But an organism, like our tree, possesses what the text calls a formative power. It communicates this power to the raw materials around it, materials that do not possess life on their own.
Nature organizes itself. It is a self-propagating, self-organizing entity.
The book points out that it's actually inadequate to call nature an analog of art, because that implies an external artist pulling the strings. It is closer to an analog of life.
Organisms are the only beings in nature that must be thought of as possible only as purposes of nature.
So if we're looking at this self-organizing miracle, how do we actually study it? Here is where the text introduces a remarkably subtle and important mental framework.
Often called the as-if rule.
Yes. And to understand it, we need to clarify two terms: a constitutive principle and a regulative principle.
Because we are humans and our scientific instruments can only measure physical matter, we cannot scientifically prove that a divine architect designed the tree.
We can't look through a microscope and observe a creator's hands shaping the cellular walls.
Therefore, we absolutely cannot treat design as an objective physical law of the universe. That would be a constitutive principle, a declaration of absolute fact about the cosmos.
And empirical science simply cannot claim it. Yet, and this is the beautiful paradox the book eliminates, in order to even begin to understand biology, we are forced to use the concept of purpose.
Anatomists, botanists, and biologists must look at organisms as if they were designed for a purpose.
When a scientist dissects a plant or an animal, they operate on the absolute assumption that nothing in nature is in vain.
They have to, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't know what to look for. When you look at the incredibly specific internal structure of a heart valve, you have to ask, why is this here? For what end?
Exactly. Without this assumption, biological science would have no guiding thread. We need this concept of purpose just to navigate the staggering complexity of life.
This is a regulative principle. It is a necessary rule for the functioning of our own human minds.
It's a lens you must look through to make sense of the organism, even if you cannot scientifically claim it was an absolute physical rule of the universe itself.
And when you look through that lens, the book gently warns you about where you point it. It makes a sharp distinction between internal purpose and external purpose.
Internal purpose is exactly what we were just doing with the tree. Or imagine studying how a simple blade of grass organizes and sustains its own cellular walls.
It is observing the internal harmony of the organism for its own sake. But the danger, the text argues, lies in obsessing over external purpose.
Looking for the purpose of a thing outside of itself, because the search for external purpose quickly leads human reason into logical dead ends.
If we look at the grass not for its internal organization but for its external utility, we might say the grass exists simply so that the ox has something to eat.
And why does the ox exist? So that humans have beasts of burden and a source of food.
But the chain immediately breaks down when you ask the final question, why is it necessary that humans should exist?
To suffer. To build strip malls.
The book points out that this is not an easy question to answer. Looking at the world through the lens of external purpose removes the categorical purpose of the thing itself.
The grass ceases to be a magnificent, self-organizing natural purpose and becomes merely a tool, a means to an end.
The book actually shares some incredibly fascinating historical tendencies we have regarding external purpose, especially when it comes to things we find deeply unpleasant.
Take vermin, or the stinging mosquitoes that make dense forests and marshes so oppressive.
One could look at them through this external teleological lens, teleological simply meaning the study of purpose or design, and say these pests were designed with a wise purpose.
To goad primitive humans into activity, the mosquitoes force humans to drain the swamps, clear the suffocating forests, and build healthier, more sanitary habitations.
There is also this bizarre anecdote about the tapeworm. The text mentions that some people historically viewed the tapeworm as a kind of set-off for a deficiency in the human digestive organs,
Forcing a sluggish system into motion.
It's a remarkably optimistic, if slightly horrifying way to look at getting a parasite.
It is an entertaining outlook, as the book itself admits, and it can even be historically instructive, leading us to see a deeply interconnected web of nature.
But the text draws a very firm, quiet boundary here. Viewing these complex interactions as perfectly designed for human benefit falls completely outside the bounds of strict physical science.
Science must remain science. Physics and natural science must not mix with theology.
If we introduce the concept of God into the context of natural science in order to explain the purposiveness of nature, and then turn around and use that purposiveness to prove that God exists,
We trap ourselves in a delusive, circular argument. Both sciences lose their internal consistency.
that boundary is so vital. The book insists we must carefully and modestly limit our language. We must say purpose of nature, asserting exactly and only as much as we actually observe with our senses.
The moment we say purpose of God to explain a biological process, science fundamentally stops. We meddle in an extraneous business.
We must speak of the wisdom and economy of nature without presuming to make it an intelligent being, which would be preposterous.
And without placing an architect above it, which would be presumptuous in the realm of empirical science.
This delicate balancing act brings us to what the book outlines as the grand conflict, the antinomy of the judgment.
An antinomy is essentially a massive, brain-breaking paradox, where two completely logical, necessary rules violently crash into each other.
When we investigate nature, our reflective judgment is pulled in two entirely opposite directions. Rule 1 states that all production of material things and their forms must be judged to be possible according to merely mechanical laws.
We must try to explain everything through simple, blind, physical cause and effect. If we don't, there can be no proper systematic knowledge of nature at all.
But then we hit a wall. We encounter a blade of grass, or a maggot born from decay, or a tree, and we realize Rule 2.
Some products of material nature simply cannot be judged to be possible, according to merely mechanical laws.
To comprehend them, we absolutely require a different law of causality. Teleology, the concept of final causes, or purpose.
It is a staggering contradiction. How can you be commanded to explain everything mechanically while simultaneously knowing you cannot explain a simple living organism mechanically?
The book resolves this conflict with profound calmness. It points out that the contradiction only exists if we mistake these rules for absolute, objective truths about the universe itself.
If we make them constitutive. But remember, they are not. They are merely regulative maxims, subjective guidelines for human investigation.
We are told to follow the mechanical rule as far as we possibly can. Trace the chemistry, map the cellular division.
But recognizing that human reason, in following that blind mechanical path, will never find the ultimate ground for the specific character of a living being, we are permitted, even required, to use the second maxim.
We reflect on these forms according to the principle of purposes. Both rules can coexist peacefully in your mind because they are just the subjective tools you need to navigate the world.
Not final declarations about the unseen inner workings of the cosmos.
To really solidify this, the book patiently walks you through how other monumental thinkers tried to solve this paradox before, and why their philosophies ultimately fall short of explaining nature's design.
First, it looks at those who rely purely on blind chance, like Epicurus and Democritus.
The idea here is that if you have infinite atoms bumping into each other over infinite time, eventually they will randomly produce the perfect reciprocal unity of an eye or a tree.
But the text quietly dismisses this as plainly absurd. Even given infinite time, the staggering, unified harmony of a living organism defies our rational acceptance of mere chance.
Random collisions might create a pile of sand, but they do not organically graft mutually dependent leaves onto a self-sustaining trunk.
So then the book turns to Spinoza, representing a system of rigid fatality. Spinoza sought to explain the unity of nature by arguing that all things are merely accidents inhering in one original being.
Everything is exactly as it must be. There is no alternative.
While this provides a kind of unconditioned necessity, it completely strips away contingency.
Contingency being the idea that something could have been otherwise, but was specifically chosen or arranged this way.
Think of a pile of stones versus a stone wall. The wall has contingency. It implies a choice in its arrangement. Without contingency, you cannot have design or purchase.
Spinoza's ontological unity is just blind, rigid necessity. It gives us no understanding of the highly specific, purposive references we see in a living organism.
The text also addresses a concept called hylozoism. This is the idea that matter itself is inherently alive, or possesses a kind of soul.
It sounds poetic, but the book points out a fundamental contradiction here. The essential defining character of physical matter is lifelessness, or inertia.
To say matter is inherently alive is to contradict its very definition. It is a logical dead end.
Finally, the book examines theism, the belief in an intelligent creator who produces the world with design and intention.
The text warmly acknowledges that for the human mind, theism is by far the most satisfying explanation. Through the concept of a supreme understanding, it rescues the purposiveness of nature from blind chance and fatalistic necessity.
However, the book maintains its strict, unwavering, critical stance. Theism still cannot be proven dogmatically by physical science.
We cannot objectively lay down the scientific proposition that there is an intelligent original being.
We can only say, subjectively, given the limits of our own human judgment, we simply cannot make sense of the organic world in any other way.
This brings us to perhaps the most breathtaking insight in the entire text. It asks you to look inward. Why are you so limited? Why do you have to rely on this as if rule?
The book dives deep into the architecture of human cognition itself. It explains that our understanding is discursive.
This means your brain is fundamentally bound to perceive from the parts to the whole.
When you look at a tree, your discursive mind has to synthesize the roots, the trunk, the branches, and the leaves over time to comprehend the concept of the whole tree.
We are constrained by time and space, building our knowledge piece by piece, step by agonizing step.
To truly understand your own limitation, the book asks you to imagine contrasting your discursive mind with an intuitive understanding.
You might think of this as how a divine or perhaps a completely alien intellect might operate. An intuitive understanding would not build from the parts.
It would instantly, simultaneously grasp the entire whole.
And from that complete, immediate comprehension of the whole, the specific parts would simply cascade and be determined automatically.
There is no step-by-step assembly required. The whole dictates the parts instantly.
Because we are humans and we do not possess that intuitive mind, we are stuck building from parts to wholes.
And when we look at an organism and see parts perfectly, harmoniously working together to maintain the whole, Our discursive minds are baffled.
We cannot explain how blind mechanical parts could assemble themselves so flawlessly. We desperately need the concept of purpose.
The idea that the concept of the whole existed before the parts and caused them to come together, just to make the organism comprehensible to our specific type of brain.
It is a profoundly humbling realization. The concept of purpose in nature is ultimately a reflection of the unique shape of human cognition.
We find ourselves peering into the workings of nature, holding two distinct lenses. We can look at a maggot born from the decay of living tissue and attempt to trace every chemical reaction, every blind mechanical law that brought it into being.
Or we can look at that same maggot teleologically, viewing it as a marvel of self-organization, a purposeful life acting against the inertia of dead matter.
Our human brain simply cannot unite these two views perfectly. One method of explanation seems to exclude the other in our understanding.
Yet the book gently guides us to see that this very inability points toward a profound, hidden reality. The compatibility of these two principles, mechanism and teleology, must lie outside of our empirical representation.
They both point toward a supersensible substrate of nature, an unknown inner ground where physical laws and purposive combinations are intimately united in a single principle.
We cannot see it, we cannot define it, but the mere existence of a blade of grass demands that it is there.
And it leaves you with a fascinating, almost haunting thought to mull over. If our minds are fundamentally wired to see purpose where there might only be mechanism, what does that mean for how we are building artificial intelligence today?
Are we simply building mirrors of our own discursive limitations,
Destined to project our own need for purpose onto the algorithms we write?
leaving us suspended right at the very edge of human reason,
Looking deeply into the mystery of the supersensible.
waiting to uncover what lies just beyond the veil of our own understanding?
And that brings us right back to that delicate tension we were just quietly unraveling. It is this really profound attempt in the book to understand how the human mind bridges that vast, seemingly unbridgeable gap between the cold, strict scientific laws of nature and the deeply felt concept of a purposeful universe.
Precisely. We find ourselves constantly suspended in this quiet, almost ultimate tug of war. On one side, you have the perspective of nature as a blind, unfeeling mechanical machine operating purely on cause and effect. And then on the other side, there is this persistent vision of a system designed with a grand, overarching intention. And what we're really navigating here, what the text so meticulously outlines, is how this exact tension directly impacts human morality and our whole sense of place in the cosmos.
Let's just sit with that limitation for a moment, because it is something you experience every single day. When you look at a natural product, say, a highly complex living organism like a bird, or even just a single leaf, your mind instinctively tries to explain it mechanically. You look for the gears turning.
Right, you look for the immediate physical causes.
Exactly. The cellular structure, the chemical reactions, the environmental pressures. But inevitably, human understanding hits a wall. The purely mechanical explanation always feels slightly incomplete when faced with life. And you find yourself subtly relying on teleology, that is, the idea of an inherent purpose or an intelligent design. We seem completely compelled to ask, what is this for, rather than just, how did this happen?
It is a very deeply rooted human compulsion. To really visualize this, imagine you are standing incredibly close to a magnificent, intricately woven tapestry. If you walk around the back of that tapestry, what you see is mechanism. You see a chaotic, almost messy tangle of raw threads, knots, loose ends, overlapping colors. It looks like pure, unguided cause and effect.
Just a mess of strings.
Right. But when you step around to the front, that is teleology. You see a beautifully designed picture, a purposeful landscape, or a portrait. For us, both sides of that tapestry are undeniably real, but our human minds simply cannot merge them perfectly into one unified perspective. We can only look at one side at a time. The book suggests that these two views stem from a supersensible reality, a hidden underlying substrate of nature that we simply cannot access with our limited senses. We are forever trapped, oscillating between the tangled threads and the beautiful image.
And it feels incredibly important to clarify where this teleological view, this instinct to see the beautiful image, actually belongs in our thinking. Because the philosophy makes it explicitly clear that teleology does not fit into natural science. Science absolutely requires strict, mechanical, predictable rules to function. You can't put purpose in a test tube.
You really can't.
But interestingly, it also argues that teleology doesn't belong to theology because we shouldn't just use God to fill in the gaps of our scientific ignorance. So if it isn't science and it isn't theology, what is it?
It functions as what is called a criticism. It is a necessary reflective tool. Think of it as a specialized lens that you use to guide your own judgment when you encounter phenomena in nature that pure, blind mechanics cannot fully explain. It isn't a hard scientific law, but a subjective framework that your mind actually requires to make sense of biological complexity.
Which naturally leads us to a rather breathtaking thought experiment introduced in the text, involving what it calls the archaeologist of nature. If you adopt this mechanical view to its absolute limit, imagine someone trying to trace the entire vast family tree of living creatures purely through mechanical evolutionary forces.
The imagery used to describe this is remarkably evocative. You are asked to picture Mother Earth passing out of a chaotic, almost prehistoric volcanic state. In the beginning, this earthly womb gives birth to creatures of a very crude, less purposive form. Then, through relentless mechanical forces and environmental pressures, those creatures give birth to others, which form themselves with greater adaptation to their surroundings.
Sort of blind churning over eons.
Yes, this slow churning goes on for ages, until the Earth's generative womb essentially ossifies, becoming cold and torpid, and the species settle into the fixed, stable forms we recognize today.
It is a dizzying, almost proto-evolutionary way of viewing the development of life. It sounds incredibly modern, but as I understand it from the book, there is a philosophical catch here. Even if you accept this beautifully mechanical, vast timeline of adaptation, the mind still cannot escape the need for a guiding purpose.
That is the crucial limitation. You can push the timeline back millions of years, and you can rely entirely on mechanical adaptation, but you still have to assume an inherently purposive organization behind Mother Earth herself. You haven't solved the mystery of purpose. You have merely pushed it one step further back into the mist of deep time. You still have to ask why inert matter possessed the capacity to arrange itself, to produce life, and to adapt in the very first place. You are still quietly leaning on the concept of a final cause, even if you try to disguise it with mechanics.
I imagine this idea of a guiding purpose or a designer faces significant philosophical pushback. I know the text directly addresses thinkers who completely reject this premise.
It does, very systematically. For instance, it addresses David Hume's famous skepticism. Hume casts serious doubt on the very possibility of a complex, purposeful designer. He essentially asks how such a supreme architectonic understanding could possibly exist and organize itself. He points out the immense, perhaps insurmountable difficulty of proving a single, unified creator just by looking at the scattered, often flawed physical world. On the other end of the spectrum, the text grapples with Spinoza's pantheism.
Could you unpack Spinoza's view a bit more for the listener? How does pantheism try to bypass this whole debate?
Spinoza tries to dissolve the problem entirely by arguing that the entire everything that exists is simply one single, all-embracing substance. In that view, God and nature are the exact same thing. Every tree, every person, every rock is just an inherent determination, a facet of that one substance. By doing this, Spinoza removes the need for an external creator with a separate overarching plan. There is no tapestry maker. There is only the tapestry constantly weaving itself.
So if we step down from the vastness of the cosmos and look at something tangible like how life actually reproduces, this becomes a perfect physical battleground for these massive ideas. The text first addresses a concept called occasionalism. This is the idea that a supreme cause immediately steps in to miraculously create every single embryo, every single time a reproduction occurs in nature. But the philosophy rejects this outright, doesn't it?
It absolutely must reject it. If you accept occasionalism, you completely destroy any possibility of the scientific study of nature. If every birth, every sprouting seed is a direct, unpredictable miracle from a supreme being, then nature has no laws of its own. It makes the world a theater of constant supernatural intervention, which is a philosophical dead end for any rational, inquiring mind trying to understand physics or biology.
That leaves us with the real debate, which is between two fascinating concepts: preformation, sometimes called involution, and epigenesis. Let's start with preformation because it is quite a humbling, almost surreal concept to try and visualize. It is the idea that every individual organism was perfectly, minutely preformed by the creator at the very beginning of the world.
Yes, the best way to imagine it is like infinite microscopic Russian nesting dolls. Under this theory, the very first human, or the first plant, contained the fully formed, infinitely tiny seeds of all its future descendants, layered one inside the other, just waiting to be unpacked and expanded throughout the entirety of history.
But the text finds a flaw in this nesting doll theory, largely because it relies so heavily on continuous supernatural protection, right?
Precisely. If those infinite microscopic forms have existed since the dawn of time, They would require constant supernatural preservation just to survive the chaotic, destructive mechanical forces of nature for millennia until it was their time to grow. It is a highly unnatural way of viewing biology. This is why the philosophy heavily favors the opposing view, which is epigenesis, championed at the time by the scientist Blumenbach.
And epigenesis is the idea that nature is self-producing, not just passively expanding what was already there. It suggests that matter isn't just dead clay, it is armed with an inner formative impulse.
That phrase, formative impulse, is key. It argues that organized matter has an inherent, mysterious, but natural drive to form and maintain itself. It still operates under the strict mechanical laws of physics and chemistry, but it is dynamic. The text favors this because it leaves nature to do its own intricate work with the absolute minimum amount of supernatural intervention. It elevates matter from a mere mechanical puppet to an active participant in its own ongoing creation. It bridges that gap between the blind machine and the purposeful design in a much more elegant, self-sustaining way.
If we zoom out from the individual organism reproducing itself and we look at the broader environment, we encounter this idea of external purposiveness. We might casually call this the food chain or the ecological web. The text outlines it beautifully. The minerals exist to nourish the soil sustains the plants feed the herbivores sustain the carnivores, and all of it ultimately forms a chain that points toward man. The philosophy posits that man is the ultimate purpose of nature on Earth.
But we must be very precise about why man holds this position. It isn't out of simple arrogance. It is because humanity, according to this framework, is the only being on Earth capable of actually forming a concept of purposes. We are the only creatures who can look at the world, understand it as a system, and deliberately organize it. The lion doesn't contemplate its role in the ecosystem, it simply hunts. Man contemplates the entire chain.
But this introduces a profound paradox. If you, as a human being, are the ultimate purpose of this vast earthly system, is your goal simply to achieve earthly happiness? The text argues a resounding, quiet no. And if you pause to consider your own experience with the world, it makes a sobering kind of sense. Nature is endlessly, indiscriminately cruel to humanity.
It is a harsh reality to face. We are subjected to plagues, freezing frosts, devastating floods, and droughts. The very earth beneath our feet is a geological memorial to ancient, chaotic desolations. Nature clearly does not prioritize our comfort or our joy. And furthermore, humanity is terribly cruel to itself. We create our own profound torments through war, systemic oppression, and deep inequality. Human desires themselves are far too unstable, too shifting, and too easily corrupted for happiness ever to be considered a universal fixed law of nature.
So if our purpose isn't something as fleeting and fragile as happiness, what is nature's ultimate purpose for humanity? The text argues that the goal is culture, but it breaks this concept of culture down into two very distinct and frankly somewhat tragic parts. First, there is the culture of skill.
The culture of skill is driven largely by inequality. It is the cold reality that the hard, mechanical labor of the vast majority of people is required to provide the basic necessities of life. And this grueling labor creates the physical leisure and the societal space for a select few to develop science, art, and higher learning. It is described almost as a splendid misery. The refinement and advancement of society as a whole often increase alongside the calamities and the heavy burdens of the oppressed.
It is a sobering way to view human progress. The second part, though, is the culture of discipline. This is much more internal. It is the quiet, incredibly difficult struggle to free the human will from the absolute tyranny of our animal instincts and our raw, primal desires.
Think about what that actually means for you in a modern context. We are constantly bombarded by impulses. The desire for immediate gratification, the pull of anger, the instinct for pure self-preservation at the expense of others. The culture of discipline is the arduous, lifelong process of becoming masters of ourselves, rather than being dragged along by our biology. It is the necessary preparation for a state of sovereignty where reason, rather than appetite, holds the ultimate authority in our lives. Achieving that sovereignty requires a very impartial, almost detached observation of human history. The text makes a rather controversial yet coldly logical point about human conflict. It argues that even the brutal, horrifying reality of war serves a hidden, almost incomprehensible purpose in the grand scheme of nature. It requires a serene detachment to view it this way. The philosophy doesn't endorse the horrors of war. Rather, it observes how the relentless, crushing pressure of conflict, the constant shifting of borders, and even the endless draining preparation for war during times of peace continually push fragmented, warring societies together. It suggests that nature blindly uses human passions, our unbridled ambitions, and our violent collisions to eventually, painfully, force us toward forming a structured, lawful, cosmopolitan civil community. We're essentially battered into civilization.
This brings us to a vital, delicate distinction in the terminology. We've established man as the ultimate purpose, the highest point within the physical chain of nature. But the text draws a hard line between that and being the final purpose. A final purpose needs no other condition. It is entirely unconditioned and completely independent of the physical laws of nature.
This is perhaps the most profound realization in the entire philosophical framework. The core insight is that man, purely as a biological entity, is not the final purpose. Only man as a noumenon can be the final purpose of creation.
Let's pause on that word to make sure it's perfectly clear. Noumenon. The text defines this as man considered purely as a moral being, endowed with absolute freedom, independent of physical cause and effect. Is that an accurate way to frame it?
It is exactly right. To really feel the weight of this distinction, imagine a highly talented, incredibly skilled individual. Perhaps they're a brilliant architect who builds magnificent infrastructure, or a scientist who cures physical diseases. They use their culture of skill to greatly benefit society. But if you look inward and you see that this person possesses a fundamentally bad, corrupt, and profoundly selfish will, internally, they remain a contemptible object. Their physical skills belong to the mechanism of nature, but their will belongs to the moral realm.
So without beings capable of understanding, freely choosing, and embodying true moral worth, the entire physical universe loses its meaning.
Yes. Without the existence of the moral noumenon, the vast swirling cosmos would be a mere waste. It would be an empty, silent theater, full of incredibly complex stage dressing, stars, galaxies, ecosystems. But utterly in vain, because there would be no audience capable of giving it absolute, unconditioned meaning. Morality is the only thing that gives the universe its final worth.
If the universe requires a moral audience, how do we prove the existence of an author behind this vast theater? The text explores physicotheology, which is the attempt to prove God simply by looking at the magnificent physical wonders of nature. You look at the perfectly designed compound eye of a bug or the intricate self-balancing course of a massive river system, and you try to infer a divine creator.
But the philosophy argues that this attempt ultimately fails. Looking at the physical perfection of nature only proves the existence of a great architect or a supremely powerful artist. It tells us absolutely nothing about that architect's final plan, their underlying wisdom, or most importantly, their moral character. To use a simple comparison, a clockmaker can construct an exceptionally beautiful, perfectly functioning clock. But the physical clock itself tells you nothing about whether the clockmaker is a just, kind, or moral person.
To find that moral dimension, we have to stop looking out the window and turn completely inward. We must shift from physicotheology to moral teleology. Within you, within all of us, there is a moral law that unconditionally commands us to strive for what the text calls the highest good.
The highest good is a very specific supreme state. It is the condition where perfect universal happiness is completely and inextricably harmonized with perfect morality. Your internal reason commands you to pursue this state without any conditions or guarantees.
And this is where the ultimate argument quietly falls into place. If we are commanded by our own internal reason to achieve this final purpose, we must logically assume it is actually possible to achieve. But when you look at the physical nature surrounding us, it is completely blind. Nature absolutely cannot guarantee that good people will be happy or that morality will ever be rewarded. You see this every day. The rain falls on the just and the unjust alike. Disease strikes the kindest individuals while the wicked often prosper.
Therefore, to make our own internal moral striving logically coherent, so that we aren't just engaging in a futile absurd exercise that inevitably leads to a crushing despair, we must subjectively assume the existence of a moral author of the world. We must assume a supreme intelligence who has the power to ultimately align the blind, mechanical, indifferent forces of nature with the pure, demanding laws of morality.
The text provides a profoundly moving example to illustrate this necessity. It asks you to picture the righteous atheist, someone very much like Spinoza. Imagine a person who acts purely out of a strict sense of moral duty, expecting absolutely no reward in this life and believing in no life after death. They are deeply, unshakably good simply because it is the right thing to do. But when this profoundly good person looks out at the physical world, what do they actually see?
They see a terrifying indifference. They see deceit, disease, violence, and the grave swallowing both the exceptionally good and the terribly bad entirely alike. They stare into a chaotic abyss where their moral actions seem to have no ultimate resonance in the physical universe.
To avoid complete moral despair, To prevent their profound, quiet respect for the moral law from crumbling into dust in the face of such a meaningless void, they are forced to make a leap. To keep striving for the good without succumbing to the creeping nihilism of a universe that simply doesn't care, they must internally, subjectively assume a moral, supreme intelligence that anchors it all. They must assume an invisible moral architecture, not as a proven scientific fact, but as a necessary foundation just to sustain their own righteous will.
It is a necessity born purely of practical moral survival. The theoretical scientific investigation of nature can only ever show us the cold, grinding gears of the machine. It takes the quiet, persistent internal voice of moral duty to project a final purpose onto the canvas of the universe, and to assume a creator whose infinite moral wisdom matches the physical complexity of the world they made.
If our inner moral compass absolutely forces us to assume this hidden, supreme moral architecture just to keep from falling into despair, how does this invisible moral blueprint dictate how we experience things like awe, beauty, and the sublime when we look out at the physical world? The fire has burned down to a quiet, steady glow.
Yeah, the shadows in the room are getting long tonight.
And the silence around us feels heavy with thought. You are sitting right here with us, our silent companion in this hushed library, as we continue our journey through the book.
We find ourselves now at the 9th part of a continuous 10-part journey through this monumental philosophical text.
It is a book that attempts nothing less than mapping the entire architecture of human thought, beauty, and purpose.
We have traversed incredible landscapes of the mind together so far.
And our mission for this segment is perhaps the most profound one yet. We are going to explore the absolute boundaries of human reason, the true nature of faith, and how our minds attempt to build a bridge across the vast chasm between the physical world of blind chance and the moral universe of duty. So, pull your chair a little closer to the hearth.
It's a remarkable place to pause and reflect. What the book is asking us to do here is to look inward. That's something so fundamental that we often look right past it.
No.
It begins by examining the inevitable voice of right and wrong. The text makes a beautiful assertion. The moral proofs of a governing being, the idea that there is some moral architecture to the universe, isn't some new discovery minted in a modern university.
It's much older than that.
Exactly. It is a seed planted in human rationality from its absolute earliest germ. It develops continually alongside our own cultivation as a species.
But wait, let me play devil's advocate for a moment here. If we look around and see nature just doing its thing, totally indifferent to our choices, why shouldn't we just accept that the universe is chaotic?
I mean, that's the obvious question.
Yeah. Why does the human mind refuse to accept that a good person and a terrible person might just end up with the exact same fate?
Well, that is the exact tension the text highlights. Imagine people living in a completely uncultivated state.
Just trying to survive.
Right. They are just going about their lives, utilizing the physical world, totally indifferent to whether nature has some grand hidden purpose.
Huh.
But the moment they begin to reflect on right and wrong, something shifts within their minds.
They start judging outcomes.
They inevitably arrive at this judgment. The final issue, the ultimate outcome of a life, simply cannot be the same for a person who has behaved candidly and fairly compared to someone who has been violent and false. The human mind possesses a hidden moral compass needle, and it constantly points toward justice.
Even if, up to the very end of their lives, the fair person met with no happiness for their virtues, and the violent person faced no punishment for their vices.
Yes.
The physical world might be blind chance, but our internal sense of duty rebels against that blindness.
Precisely. If the physical world is the only order of things, our minds are thrown into a painful contradiction. Without a supreme cause governing the world according to moral laws, our deepest sense of duty becomes a cruel joke.
A total paradox.
To have a final purpose proposed to us as a strict duty within a universe that has absolutely no mechanism to actualize it, that is a cognitive dissonance the human mind simply cannot bear. We demand a moral universe to make sense of our own internal moral laws.
And that demand is powerful, but it's also dangerous. Which brings us to an incredibly delicate operation the book performs in section 89.
The boundaries.
Yes, it establishes protective boundaries around our reason. You would think that knowing exactly what the divine is like, defining the precise nature of that supreme cause, would be the ultimate goal of philosophy. But the text argues that limiting our theoretical knowledge of the divine is actually an undeniable necessity.
It's a safeguard.
It is a safeguard for our own sanity.
A vital safeguard. If we don't limit our reason strictly to its practical moral employment, Theology inflates into what the book calls theosophy.
Getting lost in the clouds.
We get lost in transcendent concepts that completely confound human reason, trying to define the mechanics of infinity with finite brains. Or worse, it sinks into demonology.
Which is basically preventing us from imagining the creator of the universe as just a really powerful guy sitting on a cloud with a long white beard, clocking in for his shift to manage the cosmos. It's an anthropomorphic trap. We just take human traits, blow them up to massive proportions, and call it God.
That is exactly what demonology is in this context. And it isn't just theology that is protected by these boundaries. Religion itself is saved.
How so?
Without these limits, religion twists into theurgy. That is the fanatical belief that we can somehow magically feel the presence of other supersensible beings and reciprocally influence them. It becomes mysticism.
I see.
Alternatively, religion degrades into idolatry. That is the superstitious belief that we can please a supreme being through external rituals, incantations, or arbitrary practices, rather than through a genuine internal moral sentiment. If we think we theoretically know what God wants, we adjust our morals to fit our flawed, humanized theology, making religion perverted and immoral.
So it's almost like we are using the wrong tool for the job. We are using a tool designed for the physical world to try and dismantle the spiritual world.
That is a very helpful way to think about it. Think of your theoretical reason, your ability to know facts about the physical world, as a car's headlights.
Okay.
They are designed perfectly to illuminate the practical road of moral duty directly in front of you. They show you how to navigate the physical world and make ethical choices step by step.
Right, but if I park the car and point those headlights up into a foggy night sky to try and see the edge of the universe, I just end up blinding myself in the fog.
Exactly.
The headlights aren't broken, they just aren't meant to pierce the infinite abyss. If I try to use them that way, I just create dangerous, blinding illusions.
That captures the text's warning perfectly. The vanity of sophistry wants to extend our theoretical knowledge beyond the world of sense. But if we allow any pretense of theoretical insight into the nature of God's understanding and will, where do we draw the line?
There's no line.
There's no logical principle to stop the endless chaotic assumptions of reason except the one the book provides. Regarding the supersensible, absolutely nothing can be theoretically determined. Our knowledge of it is strictly practical and moral.
Which naturally leads into the book's total dismantling of natural theology. The human mind desperately wants to combine things to make a complete, neat picture.
We crave order.
The book exposes how natural theology uses illusory proofs to do this. It looks at the stunning, beautiful design in nature, like the complex ecosystem of a forest or the orbit of the planets, and it essentially says, wow, there must be a hugely intelligent creator.
Which is a natural thought.
But then it arbitrarily tacks on the concepts of omniscience, omnipotence, and a moral cause to complete the concept. It takes a subjective desire of human reason to want one single, neat principle and treats it as a logical ground of proof.
This requires us to really scrutinize those proofs. The book systematically breaks down the 4 types of theoretical proofs to show why absolutely none of them can mathematically or logically prove the existence of an original moral being. Let's start with the first one, strictly logical syllogisms.
This would be the classic logic puzzle approach. If A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C.
Right. But the book says this fails immediately because we have absolutely no physical intuition or sensory data for the supersensible. We are trying to categorize something based on physical data that simply doesn't exist.
You can't run an equation with blank variables.
We cannot apply the universal principles of nature to a divine being because those principles only apply to the objects we can see, touch, and measure.
Okay, so syllogisms are out.
The second attempted proof is analogy, and this is perhaps the most common one we encounter.
The classic watch and watchmaker argument. We see a watch, we see its gears turning with obvious purpose, and we know it was made by human understanding. We look at the universe, we see the gears of nature turning, and we assume it was made by divine understanding. It sounds so perfectly reasonable on the surface. Why does the book reject it?
Because the analogy breaks down at the cognitive level. We can use analogies for human systems. For example, we can compare the physical attraction and repulsion of bodies in physics to the legal rules and social dynamics of a human state. But we absolutely cannot transfer the specific mechanics of human understanding to a being that is entirely distinct from nature.
Because our brains only know how to process things by taking in data through our senses and categorizing them step by step. Our understanding is discursive. It moves from one thought to the next.
Exactly.
We cannot project that very human, step-by-step, sensory-dependent brain processing onto a cosmic creator. To say God understands the way a watchmaker understands is to drag the infinite down into the mud of human biology.
You cannot map human cognitive limitations onto the limitless. So that's an analogy. The third attempted proof is probable opinion. Now, probability requires empirical sensory starting points. When you calculate probability, your grounds must compare with the sufficient ground as parts to a whole. Think of stacking blocks.
But since the divine entirely lacks empirical data, there are no sensory blocks to stack. You cannot get closer to the infinite by stacking finite empirical observations. If I count 1,000 beautiful flowers, I am no closer to mathematically proving an infinite God than if I counted one flower.
Not even a fraction closer.
Probability has absolutely no place here because you can't calculate the odds of something outside of space and time.
Which brings us to the final theoretical proof, hypothesis. People will often say, well, we can't prove it, so let's just assume God is a hypothesis to explain the origin of the universe.
But there are strict rules for what makes a hypothesis valid in philosophy and science. You can't just hypothesize that a dragon ate your homework.
Right.
For a hypothesis to be valid, you must be completely certain that the thing you are hypothesizing is at least theoretically possible within the laws of nature. And because we have no physical intuition of the supersensible, we cannot theoretically prove even the mere possibility of it. We can't prove it's impossible either, but without proven possibility, a hypothesis is just an empty fantasy.
If we strip all of these theoretical proofs away, the syllogisms, the analogies, the probabilities, the hypotheses, what kind of knowledge do we actually possess? The book answers this with a quiet, brilliant categorization in section 91. It breaks down the three realms of cognition. It separates everything the human mind claims to know into things of opinion, things of fact, and things of faith.
This breakdown completely shifts how you view the information you take in every day. Let's look at the first category, things of opinion, or what the text calls opinabi.
The things we opine about.
These are objects that are physically possible to experience, but we just happen to lack the technology or the proximity right now. The book uses the example of the ether of physicists, an invisible fluid they once believed pervaded all matter, or rational inhabitants on other planets.
Yes, aliens are a perfect modern equivalent. If our telescopes were stronger, or if we could travel far enough across the galaxy, we could theoretically experience them. They are subject to the laws of physics. They are part of the sensible world, just currently out of our reach. Because we could theoretically verify them one day, we are allowed to hold opinions about them.
Then we move to the second category, things of fact, or Sublime. These are objects whose objective reality can be rigorously proved. This includes mathematical properties in geometry, like the angles of a triangle.
Undeniable facts.
It includes empirical experiences and even historical events proven through reliable testimony. But what absolutely floored me in this section is the singular exception the book highlights. There is exactly one pure, rational idea, an idea of pure reason that counts as a thing of fact, and that is the idea of freedom.
It is the cornerstone of the entire philosophy. How does a concept as abstract as freedom qualify as a thing of fact, alongside geometry and historical dates?
Let's put it in real, everyday terms. You can't put freedom under a microscope, you can't measure it with a laser, but every time you make a difficult moral choice, you prove it exists.
Through action.
Imagine you are in a situation where telling a lie would financially benefit you and no one would ever find out. All your physical instincts, your desire for comfort, your survival drive push you to lie. But you choose to tell the truth simply because it's the right thing to do. In that moment, you are physically proving that freedom exists in the real world.
By overriding your own biology.
By following the practical laws of pure reason and overriding your animal instincts, you exhibit the causality of freedom in physical experience. It is the only pure rational idea whose object is an undeniable thing of fact.
And because we have that anchor of freedom firmly planted in reality, we can safely reach the third realm. Things of faith, or mere credible. These are objects that pure practical reason commands us to assume. They are transcendent for our theoretical use, meaning we can never ever prove them scientifically. Of this kind is the highest good in the world, brought about by our freedom. And to make that highest good possible, we must assume the being of God and the immortality of the soul. These are the only objects that can properly be called things of faith.
The distinction the text draws here between historical faith and moral faith is so crucial for modern listeners. If I believe a witness about a battle that happened 500 years ago, that's historical faith. I'm trusting a record about a matter of fact.
A verifiable event.
But moral faith isn't about trusting a record, and it isn't credulity in a dogmatic theory. Moral faith is a free, constant moral attitude of the mind. It is a profound trust in the attainment of a design. It is trusting in the conditions that are absolutely necessary to fulfill our highest moral duty, even when the physical world seems entirely indifferent.
This leads us to the vital difference between looking outward at the world and looking inward at ourselves. Physical teleology, which is marveling at the intricate purpose in a flower, the stunning structure of the human eye, or the vastness of the stars, is wonderful.
It's beautiful.
The book admits it is worthy of deep respect. It prepares the mind to think about purpose. But it only proves a vastly intelligent architect of the material it worked with. It cannot mathematically prove an all-knowing, all-powerful, or perfectly moral God.
Because we are finite creatures looking through a keyhole, we do not know the full magnitude of the universe. We cannot compare the tiny portion we see to the absolute totality of all that is possible. We cannot derive the concept of infinity from our incredibly limited, finite observations.
Therefore, we must turn to moral teleology. Moral teleology isn't based on observing the physical world at all. It is based entirely on our own unavoidable internal reason and our inescapable sense of duty. It is the only path that gives us a definite practical concept of God. Because our duty demands a final moral purpose, it demands a unique author of the world who governs by moral laws. And this leads directly to religion.
And the text defines religion in such a specific, quiet, and beautiful way. Religion is simply the recognition of our duties as divine commands, not as forced submission out of a pathological, trembling fear of a punitive ruler, but as a free, sincere reverence for a cause that harmonizes with our highest moral destination. It is an act of freedom, not an act of terror.
You know, this idea of us stretching toward the impossible, of our minds reaching for concepts like a moral universe, doesn't just apply to cosmic theology. The book actually points this out in its broader endnotes about human psychology. It's fascinating to look at how this mind, the mind that demands a moral universe, operates in its daily life. Take the concept of vain wishes from endnote 9.
Yes, that endnote asks such a profoundly human question. Why do we long for things we know we cannot mechanically achieve? Why do we waste emotional energy on desires that are consciously vain, even praying to avert unavoidable evils or wishing we could turn back time? The book views this as a benevolent deception of human nature.
A trick of the mind.
If we didn't instinctively stretch our desires beyond our assured powers, if we only ever wished for what we were mathematically certain we could achieve, our powers would remain largely unused. We learn the true extent of our strength by first making trial of it, by reaching into the impossible and seeing how far our grasp actually extends.
We see a similar profound insight in endnote 38 regarding the aesthetics of the human face. The book notes that a perfectly regular, highly symmetrical face, the kind a painter might use as a flawless mathematical model of human proportion, often tells us absolutely nothing.
It's just a blank slate.
It expresses merely the general idea of the human race, but it lacks specific character. In fact, it often indicates internal mediocrity. It is the slight deviations, the moments where nature departs from the ordinary, even bordering on caricature, that reveal true genius and character. It is the friction against the perfect norm that produces greatness.
And that friction, that tension, is echoed perfectly in the discussion of the Sublime in endnotes 61 and 62, drawing heavily on Edmund Burke. It talks about how pain and terror, when modified so they aren't actually harmful to us, produce a delightful horror. It clears the mind. It relaxes our nervous system by putting our petty daily anxieties into perspective against something vast and overwhelming.
Like a storm.
Just as a terrifying thunderstorm viewed from the safety of a warm house brings a delightful horror, the concept of the infinite moral universe, the overwhelming weight of our absolute duty, and the supersensible reality of God can be awe-inspiring and terrifying. Yet because we are secure in our moral freedom, it brings a profound, quiet delight to our practical reason.
It anchors us. It reminds us that while we are small, fragile, easily broken creatures in the physical world, we are simultaneously citizens of an infinite moral order through our own freedom. The boundaries placed on our theoretical reason protect us from arrogance and illusion, while the inescapable demands of our practical reason elevate us far above mere biological mechanism.
As you sit with us, watching the fire slowly burn down, I want to leave you with a quiet, lingering question based on everything we have just explored. In our highly modern world, we're utterly obsessed with things of fact and things of opinion. We constantly demand mathematical or scientific proof for everything, treating empirical data as the only valid currency of existence. If we can't measure it, we say it isn't real. But ponder this. By ignoring things of faith, by dismissing the moral demands of our practical reasons simply because they cannot be measured in a laboratory, are we actually denying the one undeniable fact we truly possess? Are we turning our backs on our own profound, undeniable freedom?
We let that question settle into the stillness of the room, feeling the heavy, undeniable weight of the moral law within us. As we take a slow, steady breath, the thoughts continuing to unfold and deepen. We simply carry them seamlessly forward into the 10th and final part of our journey.
And that naturally pulls us right back to the very foundation of what Immanuel Kant is attempting to build for you in the book. Because when we immerse ourselves in these quiet, profound explorations of aesthetics, of the natural world, and of teleology, we are fundamentally asking a deeply personal question.
We really are. We are asking how you, as an individual human being, actually judge beauty.
Right. And we are asking what the ultimate purpose of nature might be and where you stand morally within the vastness of this universe. And teleology, just to clarify for a moment, is simply a philosophical way of explaining things by the ultimate purpose they serve, rather than just what physically caused them.
Exactly. And Kant presents a rather striking assertion right here about the mechanics of taste. He tells us that if you are going to claim universal agreement for an aesthetic judgment, which, let's face it, is inherently subjective, you absolutely must satisfy two incredibly strict conditions.
And those conditions require a tremendous amount of intellectual honesty from you as the observer.
They do. The first condition he lays out is that the cognitive powers you put into activity when you judge something to be beautiful, well, they must be exactly the same in all human beings.
He argues that this simply has to be true, doesn't he?
He does. Because if our underlying cognitive architecture wasn't shared, communication itself would be entirely impossible. You wouldn't be able to share your mental representations, let alone your deeper emotional knowledge, with anyone else in the room.
So if I see a sunset and I feel a sense of profound beauty, I am implicitly assuming that you, possessing the exact same human faculties, should be able to look at that exact same sunset and feel that exact same resonance.
Precisely. You are demanding a shared reality. But the second condition he mentions seems a lot harder to navigate in practice.
Oh, absolutely. Kant states that your judgment must remain completely, entirely pure. It cannot be mingled with mere sensations or strict, rigid concepts of the object.
Which is a tough pill to swallow.
It is. Because, wait, if I look at a beautifully designed house and I think it's gorgeous specifically because I know it perfectly functions as a warm, safe shelter from the cold rain, why does the philosophy penalize that? I mean, isn't function a part of beauty?
It's a great question, and it really gets to the heart of the fragile balancing act of pure aesthetic judgment. For Kant, recognizing that the house is a fantastic shelter is a logical judgment. It's based on a concept.
It's practical.
Right, it's practical, it's useful. But it is not a pure judgment of taste.
Yeah.
If you judge the building to be beautiful solely because it fulfills its functional concept, your judgment is mingled.
Ah, I see.
Similarly, if you look at a painting and you feel pleasure simply because, say, the smell of the oil paint reminds you of your grandmother's art studio from your childhood, that is a mingled sensation.
Because it belongs only to me.
Exactly. It belongs only to you. It's nostalgia. It is not universal beauty.
So because my grandmother's studio means absolutely nothing to you, I can't demand that you find the painting beautiful based on my personal memory.
That is exactly the point. When we make a mistake and assume everyone should agree with us based on those highly personal sensations or strict utilitarian concepts, we are just applying the privilege of universal judgment inaccurately.
The privilege itself of the law of shared aesthetic experience remains intact. We're just using it wrong.
We are. And navigating that requires a real maturity of mind, which elegantly pulls us into his observations on the burden of enlightenment.
This part of the book is so fascinating. You often hear enlightenment spoken of as a light switch. You know, you are either in the dark or you are illuminated.
Right, a binary state.
But the text makes a crucial distinction here. It suggests that enlightenment is very easy in theory, but in practice, it is incredibly difficult and painfully slow to accomplish.
It is difficult because true enlightenment, as Kant defines it, is not the passive accumulation of facts. It's not just sitting there reading 100 encyclopedias.
No, it requires the active, self-legislative use of your own reason.
Yes. To be passive in your reason is the literal opposite of enlightenment. Now, if a person only wished to fulfill their essential, basic biological purposes and had no desire to know what lies beyond their immediate understanding, well, perhaps maintaining that active reason would be easy.
But that is simply not human nature.
It isn't. You, me, all of us, we have this insatiable, burning curiosity to seek out what is beyond our understanding.
And the moment you step into that unknown, there's always someone waiting in the shadows, confidently promising that they have all the answers. It makes me think of modern algorithms or political pundits.
Oh, that is a perfect modern parallel.
There is never a shortage of people or systems perfectly willing to satisfy your curiosity for you, to essentially do your thinking for you so you don't have to bear the weight of it.
It is so incredibly tempting to just adopt an off-the-shelf worldview, which is exactly why Kant argues that maintaining true enlightenment in the mind, especially in the public mind, is so incredibly hard.
It requires discipline.
Tremendous discipline. It requires the fortitude to maintain what he calls a bare negative. It is the mental strength to stand in the quiet and say, I do not know, and I will not simply accept your easy, dogmatic answer.
That resistance, that self-legislative holding back, is what properly constitutes enlightenment.
It is a quiet, continuous discipline. And to help us map this out, the author neatly categorizes the tools we use to navigate this shared human experience.
He uses these Latin terms designating taste as our sensus communis aestheticus, meaning our shared aesthetic sense.
And our common understanding is designated as our sensus communis logicus, our shared logical sense.
These are the shared frameworks that actually allow us to coexist and communicate.
And understanding how Kant categorizes these human endeavors provides a very helpful lens for seeing how he separates art from science. It is a distinction that feels incredibly intuitive once it is laid out for you, but it requires us to step back and look at human action a bit differently.
He uses this analogy that I absolutely love just because it's so memorable. He brings up the famous story of Columbus and his egg.
Yes, the Columbus egg.
The legend goes that Columbus was at a dinner, and his detractors told him that discovering the Americas wasn't a great feat. They said anyone could have sailed west.
Right, just pointing a ship and going.
Exactly. So in response, Columbus challenged his critics to make a simple egg stand on its end. They all tried, they all failed. Then Columbus simply tapped the egg on the table, slightly crushing the bottom shell, and it stood upright.
And the critics immediately complained that anyone could do that once they knew the trick.
Naturally.
But that reaction from the critics is the perfect distillation of science, as the philosophy defines it. If you propose the problem of Columbus and his egg to a layperson, they will immediately tell you that it is not art, it is merely science.
The logic is beautifully simple there. If we know how to do it, we can do it. Knowledge directly translates into execution.
Exactly. The text notes that the same applies to the tricks of jugglers. Once the mechanical secret of the juggle is revealed to you, the mystery is gone. You possess the science of it.
You become that annoying person at the dinner party who ruins the magic trick by explaining the hidden mirrors.
Exactly. But then, the text contrasts this with the performance of a rope dancer, a tightrope walker.
Right. Let's say I understand exactly how the tightrope walker stays balanced. I understand the physics, the center of gravity, the tension of the rope, the wind resistance. I possess all the science of the act.
But knowing the physics absolutely does not mean you can step out onto a wire suspended 50 feet in the air and actually perform the act.
Not a chance. I would fall immediately.
Precisely, because it requires a physical grace, a lived skill, an embodied manifestation that goes far beyond mere theoretical knowledge. Therefore, the rope dancer's performance is elevated to the status of art.
Art requires something that cannot be merely transmitted through a textbook or an instruction manual.
It does. And Kant doesn't stop at separating art from science. He actually creates a rather surprising hierarchy of the arts themselves. Consider landscape gardening.
This part was wild to me. It seems almost counterintuitive, but the book classifies landscape gardening alongside painting.
It does, which sounds strange at first.
Right, because when you walk through a beautifully designed garden, you are obviously interacting with corporeal forms from nature, trees, shrubs, grasses, physical dirt. But the book points out that it isn't strictly a plastic art.
And just to clarify for everyone listening, plastic arts are things like sculpture, ceramics, or architecture, where you are molding or constructing a physical medium into a definitive shape.
Right. Architecture, for example, is heavily conditioned by a definitive concept. A building must function as a building. It has to keep the rain out. but a landscape garden.
A landscape garden involves merely the free play of the imagination and contemplation.
It arranges sky, land, and water simply to entertain us through light and shade.
Exactly like an aesthetic painting that has no strict, definitive utilitarian theme. It invites you into a space of pure contemplation without demanding that you understand its functional purpose.
And this valuation of pure, unforced gratification becomes even more pronounced when we look at the sharp contrast the book draws between poetry and rhetoric.
This might be one of the most striking critiques in the entire work. Kant expresses a deep, abiding love for poetry.
He really does. He states that a beautiful poem has always given the author a pure, unadulterated gratification. It is honest in its playfulness.
But rhetoric, the art of oratory, whether we're talking about a Roman politician, a modern parliamentary speaker, or a charismatic preacher, rhetoric is viewed with a deep sense of suspicion and even total disapprobation.
Now, surely not all persuasion is bad, right? Why does he condemn it so harshly?
Well, he goes so far as to call rhetoric a treacherous art. And we really must understand why he uses such a severe term. Readiness and accuracy in speaking certainly belong to the beautiful arts.
Sure, eloquence is beautiful.
But rhetoric, as the calculated art of availing oneself of the weaknesses of human beings for one's own designs, that is entirely devoid of respect.
It doesn't matter if the orator's intentions are well-meant or even practically good. The treachery lies in the method itself.
Exactly. Oratory treats human beings like machines. It seeks to emotionally overwhelm them, to bypass their quiet reflection, and to force a judgment that, once the emotional fever breaks, loses all its weight.
It is a manipulation of the sensus communis rather than a genuine appeal to it. When I read that, I couldn't help but think of modern advertising, or the way political campaigns are run today.
Identical.
It's entirely about bypassing the intellect to hit the emotional trigger. And there is a chilling historical observation the author makes to back this up.
Yes, the point about Athens and Rome.
He notes that the art of oratory reached its absolute highest peak in Athens and in Rome at the exact moments when those states were hastening to their ruin, and true patriotic sentiment had entirely disappeared.
It is a profound warning about the health of a society. When the structure of the state is decaying, the treacherous art of moving men like machines absolutely flourishes. When citizens can no longer engage in active reason, they become susceptible to the beautiful but empty promises of the rhetorician.
And speaking of the character of nations, the text also touches upon national sensibilities. It observes a cultural distinction, noting that the English are historically recognized for having a keener sense of the sublime.
Yes, the sublime. That which is vast, awe-inspiring, and perhaps a bit rough and terrifying, like a jagged, towering mountain range.
While the French are noted for possessing a keener sense of the beautiful, that which is ordered, harmonious, and socially pleasing.
And from those cultural sensibilities, the book transitions into viewing the state itself, not just as a collection of people, but as a living organism.
It uses the concept of biological organization as a direct metaphor for the state. There is a specific reference to a recently transformed nation, which is clearly a subtle allusion to the newly formed United States. But how exactly does this philosophy make this massive leap from nature and biology to the political state?
The analogy is deeply intentional. Think about how a biological body actually works. Your heart pumps blood to keep your lungs alive, but your lungs oxygenate the blood to keep your heart pumping.
They rely on each other completely.
Exactly. In a truly organized body politic, the whole is an organism. This means that every single member of the state is simultaneously a purpose and a means.
You exist for the sake of the whole, contributing your labor and your life to its possibility.
But the whole also exists to ensure your place, your rights, and your function. You are not just a disposable cog in a machine. You are determined by the idea of the whole, and you reflect that idea.
This conceptual leap shows just how deeply the author is willing to push the boundaries of reason. And he pushes even further when he ventures into the origins of life itself, exploring what he vividly calls the archaeology of nature.
This is where the text engages in what is openly called a daring venture of reason. He looks at the biological world and considers the absolute origins of organized life.
And he outright rejects the concept of generatio equivoca.
Yes, he does. That's an old, absurd idea that lifeless, crude, unorganized matter could simply, spontaneously, mechanically produce an organized living being.
Like the ancient myth that dead meat spontaneously generates maggots just through the mechanics of decay.
Right, life cannot spring from a dead stone simply through physical mechanics.
So what is the alternative he proposes?
He argues for generatio univoca in its most universal sense, meaning organic life must come from organic life. But here's where the daring venture occurs.
The evolutionary thought.
Yes. The book suggests that reason allows us to conceive of one organic being deriving from another organic being that is specifically different from it. He proposes the radical idea that water animals could gradually transform themselves into marsh animals.
And from those, over generations, into land animals, which is astonishing.
It truly is.
We are talking about late 18th century philosophy, decades before Darwin, and here is this remarkably prescient evolutionary thought. Now, the text is careful to note that empirical experience only ever shows us generatio homonima, meaning like produces like.
A dog produces a dog. An oak tree drops an acorn that makes an oak tree.
Exactly. But a priori, in the pure judgment of reason alone, there is no logical contradiction in imagining these broader epochal transformations over immense spans of time.
And this leads to a beautiful distinction made between natural history and the archaeology of nature. Natural history is simply the cataloging and description of nature as it currently is.
The present state of things.
Right. But just as human art leaves behind sculptured stones for us to study the ruins of antiquity, nature leaves behind petrifactions, fossils.
These fossils belong to the archaeology of nature?
They do, allowing us to thoughtfully conjecture about the ancient, unimaginable condition of the earth long before humans ever walked upon it.
We are reading the deep history of the world through the artifacts nature has left buried in the rock.
It is a majestic way to view the world.
It is. But as we trace this incredible chain of life, from the ancient oceans to the intricate structure of human societies, the text suddenly pauses. It forces you to confront a deeply somber, almost startling question. It asks you to evaluate the ultimate value of life itself.
And the conclusion it draws is heavy. The book states that if the value of life is estimated solely by happiness, or by what we enjoy, if the sum of all our physical and emotional inclinations is the only metric we use to measure worthing, then the value of life actually sinks below zero.
It sinks below zero. That is a devastating phrase.
It is. He challenges you directly. If the only goal of existence was mere enjoyment, who among us would willingly choose to live their exact life over again under those exact same conditions?
Think about it. Even if you could design a new plan for your life, perfectly in conformity with nature but aimed only at pleasure, would it truly be worth the suffering, the inevitable void, the unavoidable end?
It's a haunting thought.
But wait, does this mean happiness is completely worthless?
Not worthless, but absolutely insufficient. If happiness is the only metric, life is a losing proposition, because pain and decay always collect their debts.
So what is the solution? Where does the value of your life actually come from?
The philosophy insists that life's value comes solely from what we do, purposefully and morally, completely independent of nature's cruel cycles.
It is our moral agency that gives us weight. It is the only thing that doesn't erode. And therefore, man, but specifically man existing under moral laws, is the final purpose of creation.
That distinction is crucial. It is not simply that a human being is the final purpose because we are highly intelligent primates or because we happen to sit at the top of a food chain. It is only as a moral being that man can be the final purpose.
The whole of nature, with all its chaotic beauty, is subordinated to the supersensible principle of morality.
Yes, happiness, which we so often desperately mistake for the goal of life, is not a supreme objective purpose. It is merely a conditioned consequence.
If you align yourself with internal moral legislation, happiness may follow as a byproduct, but it can never be the reason for creation itself.
This realization requires us to bridge a massive gap. The gap between what we can observe with our eyes in the natural world and what we must hold true in our inner moral world. And the cognitive tool we are given to build that bridge is analogy.
Analogy is a vital instrument when we reach the absolute limits of our human understanding. The text uses the lovely, grounded example of a beaver building a dam.
Right. When you look at the beaver's intricate construction of logs and mud, you inevitably compare it to a human being building a house. Now, you know from your own internal consciousness that a human uses reason, planning, and concepts to build a shelter.
But I cannot look at the beaver and definitively say, the beaver possesses human reason. I can't interview the beaver about its architectural blueprints.
Exactly, you can't. But through analogy, looking at the similarity of the effects, the structurally sound dam and the human house, you can rightly conclude that the beaver acts on representations.
You can conclude that despite the vast, specific differences between you and the beaver, You both belong to the same genus of living, purposeful beings.
You are using what you know to grasp at what you cannot fully see.
And the philosophy takes this precise mechanic of analogy and scales it all the way up to the ultimate question, the concept of a supreme world cause.
It does. We can look at the purposiveness of the universe, the intricate design of the archaeology of nature, the moral weight of our own existence, and we can use analogy to understand the relation of a supreme being to this world.
We can conceptualize a causality analogous to an understanding.
And this is the absolute limit drawn to the text, to try and investigate what this supreme being is in itself is a completely vain and purposeless curiosity.
Our cognitive faculties simply are not equipped for it. We are trying to measure the ocean with a ruler.
Yes. Furthermore, there is a severe warning here against a specific danger, which is practical idolatry.
Practical idolatry. This is such a fascinating concept. That is when we conceive of a supreme being anthropomorphically. When we lazily imagine God as just a very large, very powerful human king sitting on a cloud.
Right. And when we do that, we start imagining that something other than pure morality can influence his will. We start thinking we can bargain.
We start believing that certain rituals, flatteries, or specific songs are a fit condition for pleasing this being, rather than simply doing what is morally right in the quiet of our own lives.
It degrades the pure moral law into a transactional relationship.
It really does.
But even as Kant sets these strict, almost austere boundaries on what we can practically know about the divine, he acknowledges a profound, inescapable human experience.
The aesthetic experience.
Yes. When you observe the sheer, breathtaking beauty of the natural world, and when you recognize the complex, manifold purposes of nature, it organically produces an emotion within you.
Even before you have a clear, rational representation of a world author, this aesthetic admiration evokes a feeling that is fundamentally religious in its texture.
It naturally inspires a deep gratitude. It inspires veneration. It is as if the aesthetic experience of nature acts directly upon your moral feeling.
It bridges that seemingly impossible gap between the cold, theoretical observation of the physical world and the warm, demanding reality of your inner moral life.
And if we allow that thought to truly settle, if our profound admiration for the sheer, silent beauty of the physical world naturally bridges the gap into our deepest moral feelings, if seeing a frost-covered landscape at dawn, or understanding the delicate, impossible biology of a simple creature is, in its essence, a moral act, how does that completely redefine the way you must walk through the world tomorrow?